Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Everqueen in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 19. Isha rose to her feet, breathing in deeply, enjoying the fresh air and sweet scents of the flowers and the fruits. It felt good to once more breathe air that was neither filtered nor polluted, and better still to feel the softness of the grass beneath her feet. To be surrounded by trees, soil, and water instead of cold steel walls, seeing nature blooming around her, it had been too long since she had done this. She felt more relaxed than she had in millennia. Even before Slaanish's birth, the Immaterium had not been peaceful, warp storms battering at her and her family's domains, Nurgle seeking to overwhelm her and eating away at her realms, at her very essence as his power grew and hers waned. No, this was far more peaceful than those long centuries of bitterly resisting the monsters slavering to devour her. Trying to preserve as much of her strength as she could, and watching her family grow weaker and weaker as their domains crumbled just as her own did. Still, now was not the time for reflecting on those memories. Pushing away her darker thoughts, she focused her attention on the Emperor and his followers. The Lord of Mankind's sharp gaze was sweeping across her forest, and tendrils of his psychic power were reaching out to analyze it all, but despite that, he seemed, not relaxed, but calmer than she had ever seen him. He was still sharp and alert, but the tension that usually permeated his aura seemed to have lessened marginally, and there was a very faint smile on his face. And perhaps most significantly, in the ether, the blazing golden star that was the Emperor, seemed to have softened ever so slightly. It was no less bright, but for the moment, its glow felt more akin to the summer sun over an ocean, rather than the harsh blaze of the desert. The mortals were radiating a mixture of shock, awe, fear, and curiosity, looking around at the forest, torn between rushing forward to examine her creation and running away from her, their instincts kept in check only by the Emperor's presence and aura. Some of them were whispering furiously to each other, and one of them gestured towards her, or, rather towards the bracelets on her wrist. Their trepidation, and fear of whether they truly suppressed her powers or not, was obvious, given she was capable of this while wearing them. Isha had herself wondered whether she would be able to create a forest like this with these restraints, and now she had her answer. She had not been able to test how much of her power remained, and truth be told, this wasn't exactly a comprehensive test either, but she was glad to know that at least this much was not beyond her. It was unfortunate that the mortals seemed so unnerved by her work, but unavoidable. In any case, there wasn't anything she could do about it unless they approached her on their own. Sitting back down, Isha settled in to wait for the Emperor to finish his scans and approach her. Astarte itched to do something. She wasn't sure whether it was to flee, or sprint forward to start taking samples, but she wanted to do something. The wait was almost unbearable. But the Emperor had commanded them to wait while he performed the preliminary scans, and so they waited. Astarte had never seen anything like the impossible forest in front of her. Oh, she had seen and even worked on the private gardens of more than a dozen warlords who maintained such things for the prestige it brought them, but nothing like this. There was no such thing as untamed nature on Terra. Only the private gardens of the elite, and the farms every empire needed to survive. Even the trees and plants that the biotechnical division had carefully cultivated in the parks and at the borders of the imperial capital under the Emperor's direction were nothing like the forest that now surrounded them. Those were small, fragile, and tame, requiring careful genetic engineering, advanced machinery, and regular maintenance. This forest was bright and verdant and alive in a way that Astarte had never known until today, and no farm or garden or park could compare to it. It was a sight from the myths of the Golden Age made reality. It was impossible and beautiful and alluring. Above all, it was terrifying. What Isha had done was not possible. Other psychers specialized in biomancy had attempted terraforming for purposes both great and small before, and even succeeded to various extents, but to purify and terraform such a large area so rapidly, with such precision and skill, nobody had ever done it. Even the Emperor's own dabbling in biomancy to aid his projects for restoring Terra had never had this level of success. And though Astarte did not doubt that the Emperor was more powerful than Isha, the idea the latter could do anything that the former could not was not a comforting thought. The Emperor regarded the forest carefully, both through the Materium and the Immaterium. In the former, it appeared as an ordinary forest. Out of place on Terra as it was now, certainly, but nothing unusual for what Terra had once been, nor on other, less damaged worlds. In the latter, the forest looked even more vibrant and beautiful, each tree taller, each fruit riper, and even the grass was thicker. And more than that, in the warped spaces and metaphors that bespoke his witch sight, it shone with emerald light, Isha's power humming in every tree, in every fruit, in each leaf and each blade of grass. Even the river, for all that Isha had not created it herself as she had everything else, had traces of the power about it that had been used to bring the water to the surface. It lent the forest a certain aura of mystery and power that reminded the emperor of the ancient myths of fae spirits and their wild domains, that humans had told each other when he was young. Fitting, he supposed, given this was a forest created by an Eldar warp construct. As for Isha herself, she usually appeared in the immaterium as a tall tree, weathered and old, yet strong, healthy, and enduring still, glowing softly, radiating warmth and life. She shone more brightly than anything else in the forest, even as she sat and waited for him to finish. When she had created the forest, the light emanating from Isha's metaphysical form had intensified considerably, the tree growing larger and pushing against a golden dome that represented the power of the bracelets he had given her, but now it was back to normal. Looking around one last time, the emperor finally stopped. There were no traps or dangers that he could see, and now more in-depth tests were required. Go, take samples and start running tests. But do not speak to the Eldar yet. He ordered the scientists, who stepped forward with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, eager to begin their work yet nervous all the same. The emperor ignored their fear for the moment. It would have to be dealt with later so that it did not interfere with their work, and in any case, ensuring his scientists maintained a moderate degree of mistrust and fear of Isha was for the best. Now, to speak to Isha. Isha ran her hands through the soil, enjoying the feeling of the warm earth in her fingers, waiting as the emperor strode towards. The Lord of Mankind came to a halt a few away, though he did not speak immediately, seemingly mulling over something. You have done well, the emperor said finally. I will need to conduct many tests on this forest before we can progress further, but it is a good step forward. Isha nodded. I am glad you are pleased by the results. I promised to aid you in restoring this world, and I intend to keep my word. The emperor returned her nod. Indeed. Now, while I will not permit you to do any more terraforming until I have analyzed this forest to my satisfaction, I do intend to see this city cleared of radiation. Astarte has already outlined her plan to you, I believe. She has. It is a good plan, and I should be able to modify the fungi and the flora to clear the radiation in this city. However, the speed of the process will depend on you. How many fungi and flowers do you wish for, and to what degree am I allowed to enhance them? Isha could enhance even just one of the organisms to the point that it could clear the entire city on its own, but she could only increase the range so far without enhancing it to a level that she suspected the emperor would disapprove of. The emperor hummed thoughtfully. Enhance at least 50 fungi and 50 flowers, and make it so that they can clear the city over the course of the next 3 months. I wish to study the process carefully. As you wish. Isha replied, crossing her legs. And if I may ask, how long are we to remain in this city? At least for the next several weeks. The emperor said, folding his arms. I intend to make sure that the process goes smoothly, and that Astarte and her subordinates can take care of this project even if you and I are not present. If all goes well, we will depart at the end of the month, but depending on any unforeseen complications, we may very well remain until the city is completely cleared. I understand. Isha said, already looking forward to the prospect of not being trapped in the emperor's fortress for so long. Isha stopped, stiffening abruptly, and she saw the emperor do the same. They had both sensed it. A dark presence, sticky and foul, radiating sickening power and corruption. It was several miles away, but approaching their location rapidly. It had been cloaked before, but now it was too close for them not to sense it, the stench unmistakable through the warp. Chaos. 20. So, Call again was this desperate. The Emperor had known that the warlord of Ursh had grown increasingly frantic and reckless as the Imperium steadily tore away at his empire, but he had not expected Caligan to be so foolish as to attempt to assassinate him like this. It was not difficult to guess how Caligan had located him. The tyrant had several Xianqianseers in his service, and it had been a long time since the Emperor had bothered to conceal his power and presence. Did Khaligan truly believe that this would succeed, or was it just foolish desperation, yet another flailing attempt to destroy the Imperium as Khaligan's empire crumbled around him? No matter. The Emperor would crush the daemons currently approaching either way, and then he would see about arranging a retaliatory strike. Valder. The Lord of Terra said, his voice resonating with power as it echoed across the forest, custodians and mortals alike stiffening to attention at the sound of his voice. Gather everyone and escort them back to the Itos Dios immediately. There is a strike force approaching this area, which should be here within a few minutes. Once on the ship, remain there, and do not allow anyone to leave. I will deal with this myself. Faithful Valder, well used to his behavior, only saluted briskly before immediately moving to carry out the orders. The other custodians had already begun to move as well, gathering the scientists. Though they all radiated some modicum of dissatisfaction and annoyance at having their work interrupted, the scientists knew better than to disobey, all of them accepting the order and hurrying away under the direction of the custodes. But one matter remained. The Emperor's eyes flickered to Isha, who was watching him carefully, her muscles tense as she waited for him to say something. His first instinct was to send her back to the Itos Dios, but he disliked the idea of leaving her alone with the custodians and the scientists. Even in her diminished state, her power bound by her shackles, she was more powerful and dangerous than any of them. He could just leave her here, behind the wards he had constructed, while he dealt with Khaligan's assassins. It was not ideal, but it was perhaps the best choice he had. But there was another option. The Emperor's eyes were burning gold. All traces of calm and satisfaction had been wiped away, his aura blazing, his expression cold and his voice hard as he barked orders at his creations. Isha had to resist the urge to take a step back as his molten gold gaze fixed itself on her and he seemed to be considering what to do with her. She would like to stay here and protect the new forest while he dealt with the force that Chaos had sent to attack them, but she suspected that it was more likely she would be sent back to the ship with the custodians. On the other hand, allowing her to do this had been a gesture of trust and it was unlikely the Emperor liked the idea of leaving her alone with a group of mortals, even if some of those mortals happened to be enhanced. So perhaps she would be permitted to shield her creation from harm. But Isha did not expect the next words that emerged from the Emperor's mouth. You will come with me. The Emperor watched as Isha's eyes widened in surprise at his words, her mind churning as she attempted to deduce his purpose. It was not difficult to understand, but perhaps being direct would suit his purposes better than allowing Isha to draw her own conclusions on his motives. I wish to assess your combat abilities. Simple and straightforward, no matter how much it went against his instincts. Judging by the power I can sense from those chaos worshippers, I do not believe that any of them are a threat to us. Nevertheless, I wish to see how you conduct yourself in combat, and this is as fine an opportunity as any. He was taking a gamble by permitting Isha to engage in battle, but he did need to assess her combat abilities. In any case, the daemons that approached were weak, hardly a challenge for either of them. It was unlikely he would ever have a better opportunity to see Isha fight. Understanding dawned on Isha as she absorbed the Emperor's words. It was faintly irritating to be subject to another test, but the way he was so blunt and straightforward about it helped, a little. And it was not as if Isha would mind a chance to cure some of the poor souls enslaved by chaos, or even to smite some daemons. She would be lying if she claimed the prospect of being allowed to exercise her power some more today did not appeal to her. Of course. She replied, curtsying slightly. What is it that you wish me to do? Be prepared to keep all the attackers as far away from the forest as possible. The Emperor responded. The wards I have constructed should prevent any harm from coming to them, but it is best to be careful. He paused for a moment, seemingly considering something before speaking again. You may not remove your bracelets, but you have my permission to act as freely as you can within their constraints. Understood. Isha said, inclining her head. It was frustrating that he would not allow her to remove her constraints even when wishing to test her combat abilities, but it was hardly as if she was helpless without them. The Emperor nodded. Then, let us go. Isha tensed slightly as she stepped beyond the wards, from her new forest to the poisoned city ruins around it, sensing the slaves of chaos approaching ever faster. The Emperor too, seemed more tense than she had ever seen him, accepting his mood after the theft of his children. good. Though his assessment of the approaching force matched with her own, it was always dangerous to underestimate chaos, especially given how irritatingly good they were at concealing their power and presence. She and the Emperor should have sensed their approach long before they actually had, but those parasites and their pawns had always been far too skilled at hiding themselves. This was a good place for a fight, at least, Isha mused, considering the desolate ruins and cracked roads, with no hint of life beyond the forest she had created. She could fight without fear of hurting anything except some crumbling buildings. Casting a wary glance at the Emperor, whose gaze was intently fixed on the horizon, Isha steeled herself and began. Recalling an ancient war melody, Isha whispered the song, ever so softly, summoning armor around herself. At first, it was white and glossy, but it only took a moment to reshape the wraith bone to her liking, the armor gaining the texture and look of hardened bark. The armor grew around her, molding itself to her body, growing under her chin, as well as on the sides and the back of her head, though leaving gaps for her ears and allowing her hair to flow freely from the top. A crude echo of her children's most primitive war garb, with it clad herself in the might of the primeval goddess she had been. In her right hand, a shimmering trident of crystal and light flowed into existence, while, on her left arm, from the elbow downwards, the armor thickened and shone with the light of the deepest forest, becoming a savage gauntlet that would tear through the result of any mortal industry. Isha would have preferred to shift her own form as well, instead of just conjuring weapons and armor, but she was uncertain how the Emperor would respond to that, and in any case, she did not wish to show him all that she was capable of. This would suffice, for now. The Emperor's gaze never wavered, but she could sense his sharp focus on her as she prepared herself, keenly examining every little thing she did. She suspected he would have questions later, but for now, he remained silent. Further opponents had finally arrived. Isha saw the slaves of ruin with her eyes at last. They were flying through the air, crackling with foul power and hurtling towards them at top speed. There must have been at least 24 of them, and as they approached, Isha realized that these were not ordinary daemon hosts. They were not mortals, no, but creatures of iron and blood, war constructs with minor daemons caged inside them. Next to her, the Emperor's eyes narrowed, and his aura thickened with power. Chaos androids. He murmured, his voice dripping with contempt. They were all the same shape as her children and humanity, though significantly larger than usual, towering metal constructs of height equal to the Emperor, their only distinguishing features being the glowing crimson eyes and the 8-pointed star of chaos carved on their chests. Isha was slightly relieved to note that daemons within the war constructs were a few of the countless minor warp predators that now roamed the warp, unaligned with any of the four. They were creatures of chaos nevertheless, true, but at least she would not have to deal with Slaanesh or Nurgle's spawn today. Then the war constructs fell from sky and the time for thought was done. The Emperor flicked his wrist and golden flames erupted into existence, surging towards the chaos androids, seeking to devour both their bodies and the daemons within until nothing remained. The androids were scattered by the inferno, what little cohesion they had broken as they all sought to save themselves. The Emperor smiled slightly. Colligan's chaos androids were dangerous, to be sure. They might only contain minor daemons, but their bodies were based on remnants of technology from the Golden Age, crafted by the warlord's most brilliant and twisted techno-sorcerers in their dark forges. Nevertheless, they were still not a match for him, and the Emperor could smell their fear. They were only attacking because they had no choice, bound too strongly to Colligan's will by dark spells and the favor that the Four had bestowed upon the despot of Ursh. One of the androids, having risen into the air to get away from the flames, opened fire on him, and was followed shortly thereafter by several others. The Emperor only raised an eyebrow, the flames condensing into a solid barrier to block the rain of bullets, plasma, and warp energy. This was almost too easy. Colligan had made better attempts at killing him in the past. The bomb that his pet techno-sorcerers had built by blending chaos sorcery with remnants of Golden Age technology came to mind. But the ruler of Ursh's resources were significantly diminished, with many of his servants slain by either the Emperor's own hand or that of the custodes. He had alchemists and engineers in his service still, but they were relatively new and inexperienced, meant to replace those who had served Colligan at his height, but had since been slain or abandoned him. A flick of his wrist saw the wall of flames intensify and expand, surging towards the chaos androids once more. But even as he fought, a significant amount of the Emperor's attention remained focused on Isha. She was a short distance away, weaving her way through her opponents with such grace and skill that she might as well have been dancing. No, he realized, she was dancing. Her movements were smooth and ceremonial even as they were deadly. Though the forms were unknown to him, the Emperor knew a war dance when he saw one. Of course, few humans could claim to have the grace and skill to use war dances in actual combat, but that was hardly a concern for Isha. She moved speed and fluidity on par with the best of his custodians, not a single movement wasted as her gleaming spear and clawed gauntlet tore through chaos androids with brutal efficiency. And much like his own, the power emanating from Isha made the daemons recoil, her power anathema to them much like his own. It was only the faintest glimpse of what Isha was capable of. But it was a start. As the chaos androids landed in front of her, Isha had not waited for them to attack first. Instead, she lunged forward and her trident lashed out, piercing the abomination's face and unleashing an emerald light that obliterated both the construct and the daemon within. The rest of the war constructs seemed surprised, taken aback by Isha's fury, but she did not give them time to gather their wits. Isha rocketed forward, plunging her gauntlet into the chest of another war construct, and ripping out the daemon within. The abomination shrieked as her claws dug into it and Isha annihilated it utterly. The others had finally rallied, and they attempted to attack her from a distance now, hurling projectiles and warp fire in her direction, but Isha simply blitzed through it, the barrage unable to penetrate her armor. Exhilaration bubbled up within her as she danced through chaos androids, her blood on fire. She danced through a perfect combination of blows to step past one of the constructs, beheading it with a swing of her trident. Then, with a gesture of her hand, thorny vines and thick roots erupted from the ground, chasing after the constructs, binding some of them in place and tearing the others apart. The daemons were frantically attempting to adapt, trying to work in cohesion in a desperate attempt to survive. Several of them rose in the air and backed away from her in a cluster, in a mockery of a military formation, their attempts severely hampered by their fundamental nature. Isha simply threw her trident at them, and the weapon flew through the air, blazing with green light and obliterating the constructs with deadly efficiency. Behind Isha, another war construct attempted to strike her from behind, but she did not even deign to glance at it. More vines erupted from the ground, and wrapped around the abominable thing, even as Isha extended a hand, willing the trident to return to her palm. The war constructs had all been annihilated, with the exception of the one behind her. Isha took in a deep breath, only now realizing how much she had sunk into her war aspect during the battle. Her armor had fused with her skin, her teeth had grown into fangs and her right hand now had claws as well. It had always been her preference to nurture and to heal rather than to go to war, but that did not mean she did not know the latter. Even before the old ones had reforged her as their weapon, Isha had been the primal goddess of a wild world and a passionate people. It was true that her aspect as the queen of the wild hunt had diminished over the ages, with her children favoring her more and more as a mother and a healer, but she had never truly lost it either. And now, it had emerged from her depths like a hibernating beast stirred to action. After thousands of years of being able to do nothing but stem the tide as her children forged Slaanesh, it felt good to finally have the upper hand over chaos. To finally enact some measure of vengeance, no matter how meager, for her lost children and family, for all the pain and agony she had suffered. It would be easy to lose herself in the thrill of revenge, to allow her war aspect to become dominant, but Isha forced herself to focus. Now was not the time to change aspects. As long as she remained on Terra, it was Isha the healer and goddess of the harvest who was needed, not Isha the vengeful mother or Isha the queen of the wild. But before Isha could tamp down on the transformation, she sensed a surge of power. She spun around and saw that the war construct behind her was growing stronger, glowing a sickly purple. One of the four had seized direct control of it, and was empowering it, she realized. Slaanesh was empowering it. 21. The moment he felt the sudden surge of power, Malkador leapt to his feet and rushed to the window of his office, his eyes turning in the direction of the battle. He could feel two overwhelming powers, his old friend, and Isha. The Sigilite had no doubt that every psyker on the planet could feel Isha. Her power was still restrained, but it was nonetheless greater than that of any being on Terra save the Emperor himself. The guardian of mankind was a blazing beacon of golden fire, and his power should have completely overshadowed that of any psyker in his vicinity, but Isha's presence was easily distinguishable, a star of emerald light, less bright and overwhelming than the Emperor's, but nonetheless impossible to miss. Malkador concentrated, doing his best to pierce through the auras of the Emperor and the Eldar warp construct to sense whatever must have caused them to unleash their powers. And, there it was. An assortment of minor daemons. Nothing to be concerned about, the Emperor could handle them easily. More worryingly, Isha's presence was changing. For as long as she had been on Terra, it had been calm and serene, and Malkador had never been able to find a trace of anything else no matter what he tried. Even when she had rebuked him for his handling of the Six, her presence had barely rippled. Now, it was. The emerald light had taken on a more fey and ominous hue, and her power felt wilder and darker. It conjured visions of primordial forests under moonlight, with fey dangers hidden in the shadows and the primal roar of some savage beast echoing in the distance. The only consolation was that it was obvious the Emperor had permitted Isha to unleash her power in such a way, perhaps even instructed her to do so. They had been discussing ways of testing her combat abilities, and the Guardian of Mankind would not have hesitated to seize an opportunity if it came upon him. And yet, Malkador could not help but worry that revelation was being reckless. For all that it was his duty to question his lord, Malkador had rarely harbored doubts such as this over the Emperor's chosen course of action. It was true that they were doing their best to buy as much time for humanity as possible, that Isha's aid had been invaluable in both accelerating their conquests and building a stronger foundation for the Imperium than they could have hoped for with the Primarches gone, but Malkador could not shake the feeling that these victories had a cost that had yet to make itself clear. The Sigillite could only hope his old friend knew what he was doing. The Fury was afraid. When the Master had sent them to attack the Golden Eagle, the Anathema, the Usurper, the Fury had known it was being sent to its doom. The Eagle Anathema Usurper was too strong to be brought down by a handful of daemons. But the Master was desperate and afraid, willing to do anything to slow down the Eagle Anathema Usurper. Even so, the Fury had not expected the Great Tree, the Verdant Queen, the Huntress, to be there as well. But it and its brethren had attacked it out of fear and the hope that the weakened Great Tree, the Verdant Queen, the Huntress, would not be as powerful as the Eagle Anathema Usurper. They had been wrong. The Great Tree's branches and roots had proven as lethal as the Eagle Anathema Usurper's talons, and now the Great Tree threatened to undo it entirely. So the daemon did the only thing it could, it prayed. To the youngest of the four, the enemy/daughter of the Great Tree, the Princess of Pleasure. And its prayers were answered. Isha jumped back as the war construct erupted in an inferno of purple flames and the daemon within was claimed by Slaanish's endless hunger. The android's skin writhed and twisted as it reshaped itself into a form loosely approximating that of one of her children, its hair shimmering white and skin glowing obscenely violet. To mortal eyes, the creature was stunning beyond belief, with incomparable allure, with hauntingly beautiful features and an aura that compelled all to approach. But Isha could see beyond the surface, to the monster underneath. In the Immaterium, Slaanish had claimed the daemon for its own, and it had changed from a shrieking minor spirit into a hideous serpent the size of a city, monstrous and mutated, with fangs dripping with venom and white-slitted eyes that watched Isha with greed. "Hello, mother." The creature smiled. Isha felt her blood boil once more, ancient instincts and a fury she had not felt in eons surging to the fore and throwing her into a charge, her world shrinking to the abomination that would dare to dash. A blazing spear of golden fire suddenly blasted through the daemon, which shrieked in agony. The Emperor strode towards Isha and the Slaanishi daemon, leaving the ashes of his own opponents behind him as he concentrated more of his power to smite the creature. He doubted that Isha truly needed his aid, for the daemon was still just that, a mere daemon, no match for a warp construct created by the Old Ones to fight in the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen, but he had given his word that he would protect Isha, and he did not intend to break it. And even so, the attention that Slaanish had focused on Isha was concerning. It could not manifest enough power to pose a threat to her, not so swiftly and without preparation, least of all in his presence, but even the amount of power it had poured into the Chaos Android was surprising. It had been a very long time since the Emperor had enjoyed surprises. And when he had heard the daemon refer to Isha as mother, and felt her power and rage spike in response, well, it seemed best to nip this in the bud. Raising his hand, the Lord of Terra conjured a dozen more spears of golden fire, preparing to bring them down upon the Slaanishi daemon and annihilate it utterly. Isha blinked, her rage mingling with surprise as the golden spear exploded on impact with the daemon, and the flames promptly reshaped themselves into burning chains to bind it in place. She had not expected the Emperor to act so swiftly. The daemon was no true threat to her, after all. Isha had thought he would wait to see how she would handle it. His swift defense was a surprise, but not an unpleasant one. Isha stepped back to observe another dozen spears of golden flame slam into the daemon as the Emperor strode closer and stood next to her. Together, they watched the daemon burn. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Isha said eventually, once her rage had subsided enough that she felt that she could speak properly. "But you did not need to intervene." Perhaps it was not the wisest thing to say, but Isha could not resist the urge to prod the Emperor a little more, to see what his reaction would be. That, and perhaps she was a little angry over not being able to kill the daemon herself. "I gave you my word that you would have my protection," the Emperor replied, extinguishing the golden flames with a wave of his hand. "And chaos is unpredictable. What happened here was unexpected, and I thought it best not to take any more risks." Isha exhaled carefully, suppressing her rage at the daemon as much as she could. "I understand. Shall we return to the forest, then? I would like to check it, just in case those parasites slipped something past us." "Of course," the Emperor replied. "Come." Malkador stepped back from the window, exhaling as the presence of daemons vanished, and Isha's power receded. It had risen sharply just now, darkening abruptly with a cold, primal rage that had made his most primitive instinct scream in terror, but then the daemon had died and she had reined herself in. Malkador had rarely felt anything like it, not since the days of the most terrible days of the Age of Strife, when fighting the mightiest of greater daemons. Still, things had gone well, it seemed, if Isha has contained herself after the Emperor killed the daemon. He still questioned his lord's decision to allow Isha to unleash her power like this, with so little preparation, and what had provoked her like this, but if anything had gone wrong, it would have been obvious. Hopefully, the terraforming had gone well too. For all that he mistrusted Isha, Malkador would be lying if he did not share the Emperor's hope to see Terra restored to life and beauty. He had not even thought it was possible before Isha had come, but now. But then, that was the story of his life, wasn't it? Malkador reflected. He believed in the Emperor's ideals and vision as something worth fighting for, as a beautiful dream that should be pursued, but he did not think that even his old friend could truly bring them to fruition. Still, one could always hope he was wrong. The Emperor watched pensively as Isha examined the forest carefully, searching for anything that chaos might have done while they were distracted. He doubted they had attention to spare, but it was always best to check. And it was clear that tending to the forest was helping Isha calm down as she methodically analyzed the forest down to the last cell. Isha had restored herself to her previous form as well, having dismissed the armor and the spear as well as shifted her body back to normal. Her presence too was calmer and more serene once more, the warrior queen of the hunt buried by serene composure once more. Seeing her in action had been interesting, to say the least. It was far from the full extent of what she was capable of, he was certain of that much, but even so, the power she had demonstrated would have been enough to crush even Valder. On the bright side, she had not taken advantage of his permission to unleash some of her power to do anything except engage in battle, which was good. Perhaps she was not as furious as he had thought, or at least not reckless enough to test him yet. That conversation had been a mistake, in retrospect. Testing Isha's control had been necessary, but after seeing Isha's expression and sensing her rage after that daemon had called her mother, the Emperor knew without a doubt that comparing her to Slaanesh had been an error. Every psyker on Terra must have felt her fury in that moment before the daemon died. He should have thought of something else. Hopefully, being allowed to create this forest and unleash some of her rage and power on those chaos androids had appeased Isha somewhat. His thoughts were interrupted as Isha stood from where she had been kneeling on the ground and approached. "Everything is fine," she informed him. "The forest is intact and uncorrupted, and ready for further study whenever you wish it." "Good," the Emperor nodded. He briefly considered postponing the mission for the moment and returning to Baihang, but he decided against it. It would serve little purpose. Instead, he pulled a communicator from his pocket and prepared to call Valder and the scientists back. Astarte watched her subordinates work with somber eyes, their enthusiasm slowly overcoming the hesitation caused by the unexpected attack. She should have been at their side, she knew, taking notes, and working to study the forest, but Astarte had never known the Emperor to allow anyone who wasn't a custodian to fight directly by his side. Not even the Thunder Warriors were allowed such a privilege. She had heard stories of Malkador doing so, in the early days of the Imperium, before she had joined, and they were most likely true, but even so, it was unnerving that the Emperor was letting an alien psyker fight by his side. She didn't like it. And yet, what could she do? Isha had proven her value 10 times over, and Astarte had no real grounds on which to raise an objection. Yet, she could not help but worry. If she had not ceased to believe in gods long before she had even met the Emperor, Astarte might have prayed. As it was, she could only hope that Isha truly was as soft as she seemed. Isha subtly stretched her muscles as she and the Emperor stepped out of the smaller vessel they had taken to and from his fortress ship. A large part of her longed to leap off the airship, to return to the forest and spend the night there, instead of on this cold, metal ship. But it was a childish instinct, and Isha consoled herself with the fact that she would return tomorrow. The work was hardly done, after all. Beside her, the Emperor was silent as he watched his scientists and creations pour from the other smaller ships, drifting back to their quarters or to new duties, many of the mortals chattering excitedly. Isha couldn't help but smile at the enthusiasm she could feel radiating from them. She hoped they would be willing to talk to her properly soon. It would be good to discuss her work with people who didn't try to suppress their curiosity and interest in it like the Emperor did. "I owe you an apology." Isha startled, shocked by the Emperor's words and, to a lesser extent, the slight veil she could feel settling around them, ensuring conversation was private. "Your Majesty," Isha said carefully, wondering if the Emperor meant what he thought she meant. The Emperor sighed slightly, a noise she had never heard from him before. "As I said, I owe you an apology. I should not have compared you to Slaanesh that day. It was a step too far. I did not realize how much of an insult it was. And for that, I offer my most sincere apologies." Isha stared at him, utterly astonished. Thank you." She had not expected him to speak to her like this for decades, if ever. "I do not regret testing you, of course," the Emperor continued, and Isha's shock drained away, replaced by a desire to roll her eyes. "Of course you don't," she thought. "But I believe our agreement will be best served by being, shall we say, direct with each other. We may not be able to trust each other or even be honest, but I do believe we can at least make an effort to be straightforward," the Emperor said, watching her intently. Isha snorted slightly. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I believe I have been perfectly straightforward with you ever since we met. I am not the one who runs tests to see how you will react." If he wanted her to be straightforward, well, she would be. The Emperor cracked a small smile at her words, the expression strange and unfamiliar so far. "True. Very well, I shall make an effort to be straightforward with you from now on, and in return, I hope you will continue your own efforts to do the same. Is that fair?" "That is fair." Isha agreed. This was more of a step forward than she'd thought achievable at this point, but she was glad he had taken the initiative to reach out for once. Perhaps they might be able to make this alliance work after all. The Emperor watched Isha return to her assigned chambers aboard the Itos Dios. He was taking a gamble here, and no doubt Malkador would have words for him about his recklessness once when they returned to Bai Hang. But then, his whole life had been a gamble, the Emperor thought wryly. His creators had taken a gamble, the human shamans on trusting a shard of long-dead alien, and that shard in trusting a primitive race which had not even invented the wheel at the time with the legacy of its extinct race. And the Emperor had continued to do so throughout the millennia. Gamble after gamble, choosing to believe that humanity could be better than it was, even after it failed and fell again and again. After the failure of the Terran League, the long ages of war afterwards, the rise of monsters and empires such as the Crimson Empire and the Terran Directorate before the Federation rose and finally restored some measure of stability, if still nothing like true peace. And then, towards the end of the Golden Age, the slow failure of the Federation and the eruption of the Gene Wars as the most brilliant and vile human minds created legions of twisted monsters for their overlords. What was choosing to believe in humanity after all that, if not a gamble? even recruiting Malkador amongst the darkness of the Age of Strife, choosing to believe Terra could be saved from the grasp of chaos, creating the Primarches, all rash, reckless things to do. What was one more reckless gamble, after all that? 22. Isha strode out onto the balcony of her chambers, breathing in deeply and smiling at the sight of the city below her. The Emperor's capital was a far cry from what it had been a mere 5 years past. Now, there were large parks and forests around the city, vibrant and green in the spring, with great trees as tall as any of the buildings, and blooming flowers. More than a dozen large lakes that shimmered a soft blue had been created across the city, and birds flew through the air, chirping happily, and settling on the great trees. And above all, sunlight shone down upon the mountain range at last. The sky above was not yet completely clear, but it was much lighter than it had once been. No longer did dense, dark clouds block the sunlight, much of the pollution having been cleared away by the devices she and the Emperor had developed together. There were still more clouds than there should have been, and they were a grayish-white in color, but they should be fixed soon. It made Isha smile. She could sense the vibrant life that hummed throughout the city, hear the singing of the birds, the pleasant hum of the trees, the bright life in every leaf and every blade of grass. The lakes thrummed with life as well, fish and other aquatic life carefully transported or cloned, in some cases both, having been placed within them. And the people were happy too. Happier than they had previously been. Their home was cleaner and more beautiful now. No longer did they breathe poison or know nothing of sunlight. Isha could see the children playing in the parks, the hustle and bustle of the markets and malls, hear the sound of traffic, and the laughter and joy of the people all around the city. There was pain, fear, and sorrow as well. Isha had never known a city without it, but that was the way of life. Baiheng was a glowing bastion of life, and Isha basked in the light that no one else could see, even through the wards on the balcony. The medicines and crops she had created for the Emperor had also aided vastly in improving the quality of life for the people of the city, and the larger Imperium as well, and that, more than anything, made Isha happy. Curing diseases, eliminating hunger, cleansing the air, she was proud of those things in a way she never could be of how her work fed the Emperor's war machine. And yet, her heart could not help but ache. As much as Isha was glad to have helped the people of Terra, she longed to be with her children. She could feel them through the warp now, their fear, their rage, their sorrow, and those who had heard her message, praying to her, searching for her. Others, who said that she and her family has failed, and they needed no gods any longer. And some of them, fearing that she had abandoned them out of anger at their crimes. I will come for you, my children. Isha promised. I am angry, yes, but I have not abandoned you. Isha stood there for several long minutes, enjoying the fresh air and the beautiful sights, before she finally sighed. It was tempting to stay here all day long, but she had work to do. I'm telling you, the Thunder Warriors are safer to use than the Legio Asteroutes. Astarte snapped, slapping her hands down on Malkador's desk. The Sigilate merely regarded her, unfazed. And why is that, Director? We don't have the Primarches. Astarte said, wishing she didn't have to repeat this argument yet again. I've told you this before. Without them, the Space Marines are inherently unstable. Even if we find the Primarches, the Space Marines will be instinctively loyal to them first and to the Emperor second. I understand that I cannot dissuade the Lord Emperor from using the Space Marines entirely, but using them as the bulk of the Imperium's elite strike force is a mistake. The Thunder Warriors already serve perfectly well in that capacity, and lack any genetic loyalty to people who are not the Emperor. Yet, the Thunder Warriors were only stabilized by Isha, whom you have expressed mistrust of before, Mikulder observed. Why suddenly change your mind, Director? Has she finally infected you with her softness after all these years? The words were spoken causally, but Astarte did not dare to imagine that Malkador was not truly suspicious. She exhaled and spoke carefully. She has not, but all evidence points to the fact that she has done nothing to the Thunder Warriors. Ever since they were stabilized, they have served the Imperium well, and have yet to show any signs of disloyalty. By contrast, both you and I know of the flaws in the genocide of the Primarches, Malkador. Not to mention that if the Primarches truly do live as the Emperor believes, we have no guarantee of their stability and trustworthiness. I do not trust Isha, but the facts speak for themselves. I truly believe replacing the Thunder Warriors with the Space Marines outright will be a mistake. Malkador grimaced, but said nothing, seemingly mulling her words over. Astarte understood his concerns, truth be told. She had struggled with years on whether or not to raise this subject to the Emperor. But she meant it when she said that she felt it was too reckless to use the Space Marines. Their genocide had some frankly alarming qualities that should not have been there. None of it had manifested as an actual problem yet, but compared to the Thunder Warriors, who had no problems any longer. Perhaps Isha could stabilize and correct the genocide if the Emperor would permit her access to it, but he was reluctant to do so, for all the trust he had placed upon her in these past years. Very well. Malkador said finally. I will support your arguments when we speak to the Emperor, though I cannot promise he will change his mind. Astarte nodded, relieved. Thank you, Malkador. She knew swaying the Emperor on this would be hard, but it had to be tried. And the last of Colligan's former generals that were holding out have been slain and their domains taken at last, my lord. Ursh is finally at its end. Valder finished his report. The Emperor smiled in satisfaction. Excellent. After Colligan's death 2 years prior, his already diminished empire had crumbled to dust, divided between petty warlords who had once served the Lord of Ursh, none of them even capable of approaching the same power and influence that Colligan had once commanded. Mopping them up and bringing them to heel had taken some time, but it was done. It had taken more than a century, but at last, there were no more kingdoms or empires that worshipped chaos upon Terra. Ursh had been the last and most terrible, but in a few short decades, it would be nothing but a memory. But the work was not done, the Emperor reminded himself. And what of the Pan-Pacific Front? He inquired. Has Dumais responded to our offered terms? Valder shook his head. No, sire. He did not respond at all, and our fleets continue to battle his. However, several of his generals that we approached have responded favorably, and the agents we sent to stir up unrest and riots have had great success. Dumais' grip on his empire diminishes by the day, and our spies say he is going more and more mad. Good, the Emperor mused, steepling his fingers. Still, instruct our spies to be careful with him, and his most powerful subordinates. Now that all the warlords of Ursh are fallen, I suspect that chaos will seek new puppets, and Dumais would be ideal. Ideally, the Emperor would have had Dumais assassinated, but the man was a genius, for all his insanity, and the remnants of Golden Age technology he had reverse-engineered made it difficult to kill him. Several assassins had been dispatched so far, and none had yet succeeded. Though perhaps it was time for another attempt. He would have to speak to Malkador on the matter. Before he or Valder could say anything further, there was a knock on the door. Come in, the Emperor said, already knowing who it was. The door of his office opened and Isha stepped in, gliding across the plush red carpet. Your Majesty, she said with a brief bow and then nodded into Valder's direction. Captain General. Lady Isha, Valder replied, returning the nod. So, tell me, what do you have for me, Isha? The Emperor asked, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. The work with your Space Marines is done, Isha informed him, offering him a data slate, which the Emperor took. Director Astarte and I have refined the design as much as we can. You have 3,000 Space Marines available and ready for deployment, and I estimate that there should be another several hundred ready by year's end. However, I'm afraid that I cannot fulfill your request to speed up their production any further. Even if we compromise on quality, it would simply not be worth it. The Emperor hummed. I see. And what of cloning? Isha stiffened, her features twisting in anger and her eyes glowing slightly. As I have told you before, I will not help you with that, Isha informed him coldly. I cannot stop you from creating clone soldiers, but I will certainly not aid you in it. And I will not change my mind no matter how many times you press me on it. The Emperor suppressed a sigh of exasperation as Valder stiffened next to him. Isha's abject refusal to aid with creating cloned Space Marines had been a source of conflict between the two of them for some years now. Oh, Astarte on her own could clone Space Marines herself, and had done so, but the process was painfully slow unless they compromised heavily on the quality. But no matter how many times he pressed Isha on the matter, she refused to help in any way that did not involve creating space marines from consenting adult recruits. Isha's soft heart was useful in many ways, but an annoying impediment in others. Still, pressuring her again was unlikely to accomplish anything. Very well, he told Isha. Is there anything else you have to report? Isha relaxed slightly, clearly relieved to have avoided this argument, but eyeing him suspiciously all the same. I'm happy to report the 6th consecutive annual yield from my farms. She replied. With the newest one, we have increased our yield by another 50%. We have a large surplus of crops and medicine that is yours to do with as you please. Even without that surplus, we have enough to supply the needs of every single person in Imperial territory for 2 years even if we halted production this instant. The Emperor nodded, pleased. The ample food and medicine produced by Isha's farms and distributed by the Imperium helped keep his people happy, and the surplus was useful for placating the people of conquered territories and persuading rebel movements to join the Imperium. With every passing day, the quality of life in the Imperium rose, and the Emperor had high hopes that Terra would once more become a post-scarcity world as it had been during the Golden Age, once it was united under one banner once more. He had been hesitant to give Isha more than the original farm, but it had turned out very well. Well done, he said, hoping to soothe the annoyance caused by his earlier inquiry. Isha nodded curtly. Thank you, Your Majesty. I must tend to my work now, however. Ah, not soothed then. You may go, then. He nodded. Hopefully, working on her farms for a few hours would calm her down. Do not forget your disguise. I will not, Isha assured him icily, not bothering to turn around as she swept from the room. The Emperor turned back to Valder, who relaxed as much as a custodes could once Isha was gone. So, is there anything else, Valder? No, sire. We are waiting on reports from the 5th Legion Marines we dispatched to scout nearby star systems, which should arrive later today or tomorrow, but there is nothing else for the moment. Very good, the Emperor said. Let me know when the reports arrive. Of course, Your Majesty. Isha strode through the large hallways of the Emperor's fortress, feeling anger bubbling in her chest. That wretched man. There were times when she thought they could almost be friends, and then he would make such ridiculous demands of her no matter how many times she refused. The memories of the war in heaven still haunted her. She had created so many clone soldiers, slave soldiers, of her own children for the old ones. And not just of her own children, but the Krooks, the Jokero and other weapon races as well. All those poor beings, who had never anything but war, who usually died, their minds, bodies and souls annihilated by the Ingur and their servants, or if they were lucky the old ones would reincarnate them to fight again. She would never be party to such a thing again, and damn the consequences. Isha did not care what the cost was. Isha forced herself to calm. She had work to do, and being angry would not help. It was time to adopt her guise, in any case. Pausing in the hallway, she focused for a moment. Her body shrank, from equal to that of the Captain General's to just a few inches above 6 feet, and her limbs and muscles shrank to the same proportions. Her pointed ears became rounded, and a quick pulse of power saw her clothes shrink as well. Now in a human guise, it would be safe for her to leave the fortress. 23. Isha made her way through the large halls of the Emperor's fortress, quietly glad for the anonymity her human guise gave her. Most of the fortress's inhabitants knew her now, and most of them said nothing, merely nodding as she passed them by. It was pleasant. Even now, her relationship with the Emperor and his closest advisors was defined by careful calculation on both sides, and the mortals who did know who she was, or at least knew her as one of her children, not human, usually regarded her with a mixture of fear and awe. But as far as most of the inhabitants of Baihung were concerned, she was merely another brilliant scientist employed by the Emperor, and there was little reason to regard her with any real fear or wariness. Finally, she emerged onto one of the large platforms that had been built to extend outside the mountain, where her newer farms were located. A series of large glass houses had been constructed across the platform, alternating with large, open-air fields where crops grew. Various scientists, part of the biotechnical division, were milling around, examining various plants and tending to work she or Astarte had given them. One of them made his way towards her. Lady Isha, Ezekiel Sedane said, bowing. Dr. Sedane. She nodded back, not stopping her walk as he followed her. I was wondering, have you made any progress on the plans on expanding the jungles of High Brazil? Isha nodded absently, her mind focused on analyzing each and every crop, plant, and medicine in the labs down to the cellular level, searching for any defects and impurities. Oh, yes. I completed it last night and informed the Emperor of it. Isha felt a flicker of anger and envy from Sedane, though he hid it well. He had been hoping to complete that particular project himself, she knew, to outshine both herself and Astarte. Perhaps she would let him, next time he brought up something like this. Isha mused as she reached out through the immaterium to tweak the gene code of a plant that had developed a harmful mutation. Expanding that jungle was hardly an urgent project, and there would have been no harm in letting Sedane sate his pride. Yes, next time, she would allow him to do it, Isha decided. I see, Sedane said finally, doing his best to conceal his sour expression. And have you given any further thought to the, project? Isha sighed slightly at the question, even as she took note of another crop that had developed a beneficial mutation, deciding to leave that in for future generations. I have, and my answer has not changed. I will not aid in any cloning of human beings, least of all super soldiers. Sedane looked vaguely disgruntled. Ambitious and ruthless though he was, the man was fiercely loyal to the Emperor, and he did not like it when people disagreed with his lord's plans. And there is nothing I can do to change your mind. Nothing the Emperor has not already tried. No, Isha replied dryly, absently accelerating the growth of a few of the younger panacea trees. It was always good to have more cures for the cruelties of chaos. Ezekiel looked sullen and Isha took pity on him. Come, she said, waving a hand towards one of the glass houses. There is something I wish to show you. Despite his current mood, Ezekiel was a scientist at heart and could not resist his curiosity, following Isha into the glass house. Here, there were a variety of fruits growing, raspberries, mangoes, bananas, but each of them had been modified to serve as a medicine for various diseases, both natural and artificial. Striding over to a table, Isha plucked a vial from a rack, along with a data slate from one of the drawers. Tell me, doctor, are you aware of what this is? Ezekiel frowned, peering at the vial. A sample of a bioweapon used by the Pan-Pacific Empire, I believe, he said after a few moments. What of it? I would like you to spend some time working on it, if you are willing, Isha replied, offering him the data slate. Ezekiel's frown deepened even as he took it. Why? Surely there is nothing I can do to improve on your work. He said somewhat bitterly. I'm afraid I'm rather busy at the moment with various other projects, especially the terraforming, Isha replied, leaning against the table and enhancing the growth of the medicinal fruits with a thought. I have been able to create a cure for it, but not an inoculant as of yet. Perhaps you could do it for me, while I'm busy. A lie, one that Astarte would not have believed, but Ezekiel was not privy to the full extent of Isha's abilities and knowledge. Sedane's eyes narrowed suspiciously, no doubt wondering what she was up to, but he also recognized an opportunity when he saw, and his pride demanded that he make an attempt to outshine her. Very well, I will see what I can do when I have the time. Isha suppressed a smile. Thank you. Now, that would soothe Sedane's wounded pride, keep him from asking her about cloning on the Emperor's behalf, and perhaps he might even learn something new that didn't involve his work. The Imperium prospers, Malkador remarked, settling into the chair opposite the Emperor. The people inch ever closer to the living standards of the Golden Age, our enemies are slowly but surely crumbling, and our soldiers are even better than we dared hope. We have even begun to deploy scouting missions to the rest of Seoul and beyond. The Emperor nodded. Yes, our plans are going far better than we hoped. At this rate, I project that we will have conquered Seoul and launched the reunification of all humans within 20 years or less. Mars remains the most problematic issue. We have the tools to solve everything else relatively easily. Far better than we had hoped for, Malkador admitted. And yet, so much of it is because of an Eldar warp construct. He raised a hand to stop the Emperor from speaking. Yes, I know. We are on a timetable, we must use every resource available to us, and she has more than upheld her side of the deal so far in exchange for a frankly trivial repayment. I deny none of that. But old habits die hard, and I still fear that this will have consequences down the line. Then we will deal with those consequences when the time comes, the guardian of mankind responded calmly, pulling out a bottle of wine, an expensive gift from one of his vassals, from his drawer and pouring the crimson liquid into a pair of glasses. Right now, the priority is reclaiming the Primarches, crushing the orcs and preventing chaos from building up. Everything else can wait. And I am still very much the stronger partner here. Isha, even if we assume that she has been lying all this time, is no fool. She will not endanger her life and her people's well-being recklessly. I am aware, Malkador said, accepting the glass of wine and sipping from it, savoring the rich, sweet taste. Still, so much of our infrastructure and resources are dependent on Isha now. It makes me uncomfortable. But you're right, speed is the priority here. What would happen if they failed to reclaim the Primarches or crush the orcs in time did not bear thinking about. The Emperor nodded. I do have plans for making us less reliant on Isha soon. I have studied her work extensively, and I believe we can reproduce a not inconsiderable amount of it once we have the proper facilities. We will need to capture Luna, but once we have, we can repurpose much of the Selenar gene labs to serve as the primary source of food and medicine for the Imperium instead of Isha's farms. That is good, Malkador said with a sigh, taking another drink of wine. And yet, the issue still comes back to speed. We will not be able to take Luna for at least another 3 years. We are going as fast as we can with our current resources. The Emperor replied, setting his wine down and steepling his fingers. Any faster would hamper our efforts to build up a strong base to expand from, not help it. The Lord of Mankind frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. If only Isha was willing to lend more aid with the production of the Asteroots, but she is angered every time I press her on the topic. Malkador snorted slightly. You asked her about cloning again, didn't you? I did, the Emperor replied, leaning back in his chair. It had to be done. Malkador shook his head and set down his empty glass. How many times are you going to do this song and dance? You raise it, she gets angry, and then you two don't talk about it for months until you think that she might be amenable to agreeing. It turns out her answer hasn't changed and the whole process repeats. This is, what, the 5th time? I'm afraid I've forgotten. The 6th, the Emperor corrected, a little sourly, well aware that Malkador had forgotten nothing and was merely needling him. Malkador chuckled. You need to learn to let things go. As useful as being able to clone Space Marines rapidly would be, we are already considerably ahead of schedule and the Thunder Warriors serve their role well enough for now. Yes, but it could be faster, the Emperor retorted. The faster we can finish the conquest of Earth, the less time that Chaos and the Orcs have to grow stronger and the more quickly we can find the Primarches. Have you actually informed Isha of that last part? Malkador inquired dryly. Or only the first 2? The Emperor's silence was telling. Malkador sighed. I do not think she will ever agree to cloning, given what she told us of her experiences during the War in Heaven, but if you told her that you are looking for your sons, she might give up some other secret or creation that would speed up the conquest. Use her soft heart to your advantage, old friend, do not try to work against it. The Master of the Imperium still did not deign to respond, and Malkador sighed again. He understood his friend's reticence in confiding his fears and worries for his lost children in anyone, much less an Eldar goddess the two of them had known for the blink of an eye, relatively speaking, but they truly did need to speed up the Imperium's rise to power as much as possible. And given how much they had trusted Isha with already. I will speak to her about it, the Emperor said finally. And I shall see what I can convince her to do so. Malkador nodded. He considered it for a moment, and decided that this was as good a moment as any to inform the Emperor that Astarte wished to speak to him on the matter of the Thunder Warriors and Space Marines. But as Malkador opened his mouth, the doors to the Emperor's study burst open, and Valder entered, the usually dignified Captain General hurtling like a bullet towards the Emperor's desk. Valder? Malkador questioned as the Captain General slid to a halt in front of them, concerned by this deeply uncharacteristic behavior. What in the world is the matter? The Captain General spoke so rapidly that no one without superhuman perception would have understood him, his words shocking Malkador to the core and causing the Emperor to go completely rigid. The Star Hunters sent a report back from the Thonia system. They have found a Primarch. 24. A Primarch had been found. One of his sons had been found. The Emperor was frozen for a single heartbeat, before his voice returned to him and he spoke. Valder, prepare a ship for me immediately, the fastest one we have. You will accompany me, and a detachment of 100 custodians besides, along with as many soldiers as you deem appropriate. Do not bother with any astropaths or navigators, I will handle that part myself. This is the top priority, and we set out today. You have my full authority to do whatever needs to be done to speed up the process. Valder bowed, and departed as swiftly as he had arrived. There were times when the Emperor regretted the unhesitating obedience and loyalty he had indoctrinated all his custodians with. Now was not one of them. But as Valder left, Malkador recovered from his surprise at least. My friend, are you sure this is wise? Setting out so swiftly, without any preparations. It is necessary, the Emperor cut him off sharply. Who knows what chaos will do if we do not retrieve the Primarch immediately. And a Primarch would be an enormous aid with the unification of Terra and Sol. It is vital that we retrieve him so that we can repair any damage that might have been done to him, prevent any further damage and begin preparing him for his role as soon as possible. It was a perfectly logical, rational argument. But from Malkador's narrowed eyes, he clearly suspected that it was not logic which drove the Emperor, and he wasn't wrong. But the Sigillite didn't argue further. What do you wish for me to do in your absence, then? Malkador inquired. You will serve as Imperial Regent, of course, the Emperor said, pleased that his old friend wasn't arguing. You will be my voice and right hand, and all should obey you as they obey me while I am gone. Malkador nodded. I'll start preparing, then. We'll have to be ready, in case any of our enemies decide to take advantage of your absence. The Emperor suppressed a grimace. He knew they would, but what choice did he have? His son had to be retrieved immediately, and nobody else could be trusted, not even Malkador or Valder. Because depending on what the four had done, the Emperor might not return to Terra with his son at his side, but with his hands stained with the blood of yet another of his children. It never got easier. He had killed too many of his children. Whether lost to demonic corruption, or gone mad with power, or grief, or suffering. He had given them the only peace he could, and for that he carried each and every one of their faces with him, haunting his every step. The thought of another joining them flooded him with revulsion. But it might have to be done, nevertheless, though the Emperor hoped it would not be so. Revelation voiced none of this, instead speaking again. I will leave Valder behind to aid you, then. I do not strictly need him along, and his military expertise will be useful. Yes, Malkador agreed, pausing for a moment before speaking. What of Isha? Isha, yes. He had almost forgotten her. What was he going to do with her? He could not simply allow her to run free while he was gone, not even with the tentative trust they had built up over the years. He could confine her to her chambers once more, but even then, the risk was too high. All of his instincts screamed at the idea of leaving an alien warp construct on Terra in his absence. There was only one solution. She will come with me, the Emperor said. I cannot afford to leave her without my supervision. As you wish, my lord, Malkador said, looking relieved at his decision. And, the Emperor thought silently. If anything has happened to my son, perhaps Isha can cure him where I cannot. You've grown big and strong, Isha chuckled as she scratched the enormous white tiger on the head, the beast purring under her touch. The creature was still as strong and healthy as it had been when she had first recreated it from the DNA samples and genetic records the Emperor had provided, and needed neither healing nor any corrections to its genetic code at the moment. Patting it affectionately on the head one last time, Isha turned her attention to the tiger's mate, who was lying nearby, curled protectively around her cubs. Not wanting to disturb them, Isha probed them gently without touching them, making sure they were healthy. The cubs appeared to be suffering from a mild illness, which Isha quickly cured. Satisfied, Isha conjured a few large hunks of meat with a snap of her fingers, allowing them to drop to the floor where the tigers eagerly fell upon them. Isha's smile widened at the sight of them eagerly tearing apart and eating the meat. She knew that some of the mortal scientists found such a sight uncomfortable, but Isha knew it was simply the way of life. Leaving the tigers to their meal, Isha strode away to examine her next set of patients, enjoying the feel of the sun on her skin, the cool breeze and the sense of life all around her, from the great trees to every insect and blade of grass. The wildlife sanctuary, as the Emperor had called it, was one of the projects that Isha had enjoyed most during her time on Terra. It had only been a year ago that he had finally permitted her to create a forest near his capital, where she could recreate many of the Terran animals that had gone extinct in the eons past. Cloning and tending to these various animals, as well as creating an ecosystem which could cope with such drastically different animals who had coexisted before, had been most enjoyable. For a time, Isha simply strolled through the woods, taking a few moments to analyze the trees and help them grow a little where they needed it, until she stumbled upon a clearing, where there was a bear. The bear was feasting, ripping away at the carcass of a deer, its teeth and claws stained with blood and meat. Isha felt a little pity for the deer, but such was the circle of life. One day, the bear would die, and its body would become part of the nutrients that deer in the future would eat. She strode over to the bear, which froze at her approach. Isha could tell that its instincts were screaming at it that she was a threat, a greater and more terrible predator. Which she was, she supposed, but she meant no harm. Isha raised a hand to placate it, but the bear had decided retreat was the best option, and promptly turned and fled. Isha could have stopped it easily, but that would have been unnecessary and cruel. Sighing slightly, Isha knelt to pluck a piece of meat from the deer's carcass and popped it into her mouth, enjoying the taste of the raw, juicy meat. Once she had eaten, Isha began humming to herself softly, an old song composed in her honor by her children long before the war in heaven. It was crude and primitive compared to the wondrous melodies they had devised in the ages since, but it remained one of Isha's favorites. And as she hummed, the animals responded to her call. Many birds came to her call, sparrows settling on her shoulder, a few crows circling some ways above her head and a few vultures and wolves coming down to nip at the deer carcass. Isha idly scanned them all, making sure they were all healthy and happy, making sure to stop them from fighting, though that required cloning some more of the deer so that there was enough for everyone. Other animals came too, squirrels coming by, for whom Isha conjured nuts to eat. A serpent twined around her leg and even had the audacity to try and sink its fangs into her leg, though it only harmed itself in doing so. Laughing slightly, Isha patted the snake on the head, healing the damage to its mouth. Eventually, the bear returned as well, its curiosity and the call of the song overcoming its fear. When it saw the vultures feasting on its prey, the bear growled, but subsided when Isha gave it a warning look. To soothe it, Isha cloned more of the deer carcass and tossed it to the beast, who eagerly fell upon the meat. Smiling slightly in amusement, Isha sat down on the grass and leaned against the bear as it ate, idly watching the animals come and go from the clearing. For a long while, she stayed like that, drawing the animals to her with her humming and checking them over, cloning more deer carcass to eat. It was on this scene that a custodian arrived, striding into the clearing and stopping a few meters away from Isha. "Yes, what is it?" Isha asked lazily. She had sensed the custodian's approach several minutes ago, but she didn't feel like getting up at the moment. "His Majesty has an urgent message for you," the custodian informed Isha, her voice as cool and robotic as usual. "He says that he intends to depart Terra shortly, and intends to take you with him. You are to report to his study as soon as possible." Isha jolted, genuinely surprised by the message. The Emperor intended to leave the planet? And take her with him? What in the world was going on? She rose to her feet, gently shooing the disappointed animals away. "Let's go," Isha said briskly, striding over to join the custodian, who inclined her head. Walking alongside the custodians, Isha could feel the future shifting. She was not Liliath, but she was still a goddess, and she had spent the last few years trying to hone her long-neglected skills whenever she could. Isha could tell that something important had happened, and was going to happen. Whatever it was going to change a great deal. Malkador sat down in his chambers, taking a sip of the hot cup of tea he'd just made. Despite the army of servants at his disposal, he had always enjoyed making food and drink himself, and it was safer too, so his chambers had a large, well-equipped kitchen attached. Here, in the privacy of his chambers, was one of the few places where he could truly be. The warm wooden floor, the cream-colored walls, the soft blue couch and cushioned chairs which wouldn't have been out of place in the house of a well-off but normal family, yet would have had the elite of the Imperium turning up their noses in the incredibly unlikely scenario they were given access to his private sanctum. All of it had been crafted very specifically to his tastes, to help him relax so that he could consider troubling matters with a clear mind. Leaning back, Malkador considered what had just happened. The Emperor was usually highly rational and calculating, if somewhat more prone to taking risks than Malkador would have liked, but if he had a blind spot, it was the Primarches. It was true the Primarches had been created to serve as the Emperor's closest companions and aides, to help him raise humanity to new heights, surpassing what they had achieved in the Golden Age, and it was indeed a good thing that his friend, who had so few personal connections, considered the Primarches his children, but all the same, Malkador couldn't help but fear that the Chaos Gods would take advantage of that affection. It would have been less of a problem if the Primarches had been raised on Terra, but now, if his friend could not deal with the Primarches objectively, it might be catastrophic. If the Primarch on Thonia had been corrupted, and the Emperor had to kill him, Malkador did not know what that would do to his old friend, but he was certain that it would be nothing good. Malkador could only hope he was wrong. "One of your sons has been found," Isha exclaimed, astonished for the second time in as many hours. But she was also pleased. "That is wonderful news," she said warmly. It also made sense now why he wanted to take her along. He didn't want to leave Isha alone on Terra. The Emperor gave a terse nod in response. "Yes, in Thonia. It's not too far from Terra, and I can guide the ship to reach there swiftly. I will need you along to help me, in case anything has happened to my son." Isha sobered at the words. He was right, there was no telling what chaos might have done to the boy. "I will help you in any way I can," she assured him. "If your son has been harmed in any way, I am sure the two of us together can heal him." The Emperor simply nodded in response, though Isha didn't take offense, that was simply his way. For a few moments there was silence, before the Emperor spoke again. "I assume your projects will all be fine with you?" "Yes, they're all progressing very well," Isha replied. "They can do without me for a while. Your biotechnical division should be able to take care of them easily." "Good," the Emperor replied, taking a deep breath. "Now, shall we?" "Yes," Isha smiled, anticipation rising in her chest at the thought of leaving Terra and seeing another world for the first time in years. "Let's." 25. Isha couldn't help but feel giddy as she and the Emperor made their way through his fortress. The idea of leaving Terra for the first time in years, even if only briefly and still under supervision, was intoxicating. Terra was a strong world that had endured a great deal and not died, and she had enjoyed restoring it to beauty and life, but seeing another world would be wonderful. What sort of world would Thonia be, she wondered. A war-torn world like Terra? A desolate hellscape? A lush, verdant world brimming with life? Isha would be delighted if it was the last one, but seeing any sort of world other than Terra would be wonderful. These last few years of being constrained in a way she had never been before had not been unpleasant, exactly, especially given what she was escaping from, but certainly limiting and somewhat uncomfortable. She longed for the day she could return to the stars, and reach out to her children, and help them at last. When she could finally strike back at chaos actively and in her own way, instead of having to play at being the Emperor's servant. It would not happen anytime soon, Isha knew, but it was also not out of reach. The Emperor brooded silently, fear and worry gnawing at his mind. All the terror and horror and rage he had felt when the Primarches had been stolen had returned with full force after he had spent years suppressing it, and now he could not stop himself from conjuring nightmarish visions of what his son might have become. A warlord, worshipping the four and drenched in their foul power? A priest-king, preaching madness and horror, corrupting the innocent and transforming them into monsters? An insane sorcerer, delving into the darkest and most forbidden arts in pursuit of power, uncaring of the price he had to pay, whether it was something of his own or the lives of others. A child trapped in his own mind, screaming in agony as a daemon possessed its body and used it as a tool to carry out atrocities? Revelation hated to even think it, but the last might be the easiest to deal with. He had freed people from possession before, and with Isha's aid, healing any damage would be a trivial matter. Don't be paranoid, he told himself. If things were as bad as he feared, the Star Hunters would have said something in their report. But there was always the chance that chaos was deceiving them, waiting for its moment to strike. And the Star Hunter report had not exactly been detailed about the Primarch, only that they had briefly encountered and were attempting to track him down. But whatever they found would not be easy to deal with, of that much the Emperor was certain. His foresight was still clouded by chaos. It was a struggle to divine anything, let alone his sons, whom the Four had done everything they could to obscure from him, but one did not need prophetic abilities to predict that chaos would not make this easy. It was honestly something of a relief to have Isha at his side. If she were not here, the Emperor did not know what he might have to do with his son. As it was, there was still a chance he might have to kill his own child, but the odds of that would be drastically reduced with Isha's aid. Isha and he working together could purify and save his sons from chaos, in a way that he alone most likely could not. It would not be easy, but it could be done. "We are coming, my son," the Emperor promised silently. "And nothing shall stop us from saving you." "What is Thonia like?" Isha's voice interrupted his thoughts, her voice light and curious. The Emperor looked at her and felt a sharp flicker of annoyance as he realized that Isha was looking forward to this. Well, of course she was, he reminded himself. It was hardly a surprise. Anyone in her position would have been. Squashing his annoyance as best as he could, the Emperor considered her question. "I have not visited Thonia in thousands of years, but during the Golden Age, it was mainly an industrial world. It served as a great center of industry, and was rich with resources for mining. Now, the reports for the Star Hunters tell me it is a polluted hive world. Most of the industrial infrastructure has broken down or been stolen, and the cities are overrun by gangs and criminals. However, the true masters of the world are agents of the Mechanicum." "The Mechanicum?" Isha repeated, her eyes alight with curiosity. "The polity that rules Mars, yes? What interest do they have in Thonia?" "They have been scavenging it for any remaining scraps of its resources and more importantly, remnants of Golden Age technology that might remain there," the Emperor explained. "According to the Star Hunters, they have been there for at least a few decades, and have likely found all there is to be found, but the tech priests are obsessive. They will not leave until and unless that obsession is satisfied. Calling them Thonia's masters is perhaps something of a misnomer. They have no interest in ruling it, but they are the most powerful faction on the planet, and the gangs all fear they should not be any obstacle to us, but we will have to be careful. I intend to bring Mars into the Imperium in time, and it would be best not to antagonize them." Isha nodded in understanding. "Of course. But this Mechanicum, they worship a machine god, do they not? A deity they believe is the source of all knowledge and technology. That is the core of their ideology." "They do," the Emperor acknowledged, suspicion flaring in his heart. Did Isha know, or at least suspect? She had known of him before coming to Terra, so clearly she and her brethren had observed him before, but he had never been quite sure just how much she knew. "I'm curious," Isha said lightly. "How exactly do you intend to deal with their religion when integrating them into the Imperium?" The Emperor felt another spike of annoyance. "I have prepared plans on how to deal with," he informed her curtly, unwilling to admit that he would probably have to tolerate the Mechanicum religion in order to gain access to the Ring of Iron. "I will let you know of them when you need to know." Isha inclined her head, not pressing the point, though there was still amusement glittering in her eyes. "If I might ask, what are the people of Thonia like?" Isha asked instead. "Yes, the world has been overrun by gangs, but that does not tell me much." The report from the Star Hunters did not say so much, the Emperor admitted. But what they did say is that Thonia is a lawless and brutal world, where survival of the fittest is the order of the day. The people of Thonia apparently refer to themselves with a word that is best translated as gangs into Gothic, but I believe that is merely a quirk of the language. Tribes or clans would be a better description of how they work. Each gang rules over a certain amount of territory, imposes its own laws and competes with the others. That said, their organization and structure does seem to be closer to that of powerful criminal syndicates than more primitive tribal structures or noble families. Isha nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds interesting," she said without a hint of irony. The ancient warp entity was genuinely interested in the people of Thonia and their social structure, and not merely from the perspective of a scientist. I look forward to seeing it. Isha's earnestness could be truly exasperating sometimes, the Emperor thought a little sourly. But they were at their destination, and the Emperor's eagerness to leave and find his son overwhelmed any irritation he might have felt. The Asteria spaceport was a marvel of engineering and technology, designed by the Emperor himself. It had been built atop Bihung and the Himalayan mountains that surrounded it, a vast, glittering structure perched upon a mountain that shone gold, capable of launching and hosting dozens upon dozens of spacecraft. To call it a spaceport was something of a misnomer, for it was not only meant as a place for ships to land and leave, it was meant to manufacture them, and here, the first starcrafts of the Imperium had been built. Most of them were small things, gilded and gleaming as was the Emperor's preference, but nonetheless designed mainly as scout ships, to explore the rest of Sol and systems nearby. Armed and able to defend themselves, but the true warships were still in development. Save one. The Epona was a large golden starship, a solid 4 kilometers long, and everything on it had been designed by the Emperor himself. The weapons, the shields, the sublight and warp drives, indeed, a great many of those components had been crafted by the Emperor himself in his own labs, and he had personally fitted them to the ship. It was only a precursor to the great vessels still in development, the warships that would be the Imperium's sword to conquer the stars and reunite humanity, but it was the finest and fastest ship on Terra nevertheless, and the Emperor was glad he had taken the time to build and install the warp drive himself, rather than assigning the job to someone else. Valder was waiting for them at the ship's ramp, along with another custodian and a woman dressed in a naval officer's uniform, Captain Alexandros, whom the Emperor had chosen to captain the Epona. Both of them bowed when the Emperor neared him. "Sire, everything is ready. The ship has been stocked to the fullest, there are 100 custodians and multiple Imperial regiments aboard," Valder explained, quick and concise. Usually, the Emperor would have wanted a more detailed report, but he trusted Valder and expediency was paramount at the moment. The woman nodded as well. "Your Majesty, the ship is ready for departure. We only await your orders." The Emperor nodded, satisfied. "And Shield Captain Juno, are you and your detachment ready?" "We live to serve, Lord Emperor," the custodian replied, her voice calm and unwavering. "Then it is time to go," the Emperor said, striding up the ramp as Isha, Captain Alexandros, and Juno followed him. The interior of the ship had been modeled according to both his tastes and the need to make a show of power, with the hallways being large and tall, embellished with gleaming golden walls, plush red carpets and the Raptor Imperialis painted on the walls. But right now, the Emperor cared for none of that, his mind occupied with other matters. Their group reached the command deck, and Alexandros began barking orders, but the Emperor paid it no mind. Alexandros was perfectly competent and did not need him peering over her shoulder. Instead, he focused on extending his power and wrapping it around the ship in addition to the wards that he had already placed during the constructions, and peering into the warp to chart a path straight to their destination. They couldn't reach Thonia fast enough. Isha leaned against a wall as the ship rose into the air and, gathering speed, headed straight for orbit. The rapid rise in speed might have been disconcerting for a mortal, but Isha had traveled on far faster ships, and only closed her eyes. Looking into the warp, she could see the intricate wards built around the Epona, and the additional layer of power the Emperor had wrapped around them, shimmering shields of golden fire. Below them, she could see the countless sparks of life on Terra getting further and further away, but still glowing in infinite colors, from the vast population of humans to the smallest blade of grass, all of them bursting with life. And as the ship left Terra's orbit, and entered the Immaterium, Isha could see them too. The endless horrors that now ruled the ether, the countless fragments of the Chaos Gods hurling themselves at the ship's shields but unable to penetrate the Emperor's protection. The four themselves had their gazes fixed upon the ship, upon the Emperor, upon her. They wanted her, caged and bound, unable to defy them, a helpless trophy unable to do anything but scream and weep as her children died and the galaxy hurtled towards damnation. Isha swallowed, doing her best to ignore her sudden terror. She was safe. The Emperor would not break his side of the deal, and the wards he had crafted were potent. The four, no matter what they might have wished, lacked the focus and will to concentrate enough power to break through the wards. They were too incoherent, shrieking storms of insanity, unable to divert power away from their endless war from each other, even to focus on the anathema. Still, Isha could not shake the fear that had suddenly taken a hold of her, her earlier joy at leaving terror fading. Suddenly, she was very glad for the Emperor's desire for speed. This trip couldn't be over fast enough. 26. As the Epona entered the warp, the Emperor focused. He opened his mind's eye and looked straight into the Sea of Souls, far more clearly and deeply than any mortal psyker could, or should. He could see the ruinous powers, 4 great storms of frothing insanity, competing with each other for power in an endless war. He could see the infinite horrors that now ruled the Immaterium, from the most meager spirit to the greatest of the daemon princes. But his enemies were not all he saw. Colors that did not exist in the Materium flashed through his mind. He could feel the flames of 1,000 stars, and the ores of 1,000,000 meteorites. He could feel the people of Sol, the Selenar gene cults on Luna, the Mechanicum, and their machine spirits, the war witches of Venus, the aliens who had conquered Jupiter's moons, the alien pirates on Saturn, and the monsters who had transformed Sedna into a war machine. However, none of them were the Emperor's concern at the moment. They would have his attention later. For now, he focused on reaching his son. Navigators had to carefully chart a course through the storm of the warp, choosing the safest current to carry their ship to their destination. Even before the Age of Strife, the Immaterium had been as wild and perilous as any ocean, and navigators had to choose which routes and currents to take carefully. Not so for the guardian of mankind. His power curled around the ship as a cloak of golden fire, an inferno of power that burned through the endless nightmares and armies of daemons, 1,000 times more effective than the ship's Geller field. The Epona cut through the warp on an arrow straight path, straight towards the world that the Emperor could see in his mind's eye, so close and yet so far. Thonia. It was a world that stank of human suffering and greed, the planet destroyed by cruel exploitation and the people left to suffer and die amidst the ruins. He could sense the countless mortals living in the damaged hive cities, the machine spirits of the Mechanicum expedition, the star hunters and, his son. Not even the 4 could conceal his son from his sight, not when the boy was so close, and the Emperor knew where he was. The Primarchus soul, which Revelation had so painstakingly crafted for decades, shone like a bright beacon, calling out to its creator. It was the 16th, the Emperor realized, the soul which he had crafted to be his greatest general, to be both conqueror and liberator, bringing worlds into the Imperium through both force of arms and diplomacy. And it was untainted, to the Emperor's relief. Clean and pure and shining, without a trace of taint on it. Be careful, he reminded himself. Chaos had hidden things from him before, and even now he did not know how they had breached his wards to open a warp portal within his laboratory. His son might seem untainted and pure, but Revelation could not know for certain until he found the boy and examined him. And, a small part of him pointed out, he should probably let Isha examine the boy too. His gaze flickered to the Eldar warp construct, still in her human guise, who was leaning against the wall, her body taut with tension, in stark contrast to her earlier eagerness. She was afraid, the Emperor realized, and why wouldn't she be? He could feel the burning gazes of the 4 upon the ship, especially Nurgle and Slaanesh. Well, probably best to distract her, and tackle the subject of the boy as well. Captain Alexandros, continue your work. I need to speak to Lady Isha privately. Isha, come. Yes, Your Majesty, the captain said, saluting sharply. Isha said nothing, her face still looking unusually strained, but she nodded sharply and followed him as he left the bridge of the ship and made his way to his chambers, Shield Captain Juno following behind both of them. Several minutes of terse silence followed, the Emperor still dividing his attention between guiding the ship and thinking about Horus, until they arrived at his private chambers. The chambers were large and expansive, including an office, several bedrooms, and a meeting room for entertaining diplomats. He briefly considered the office, but ultimately decided to move to the meeting room instead, Isha beside him as Juno stayed to guard the door outside. Walking into the meeting room, the Emperor was faintly pleased to note that the chambers had been arranged according to his liking, with plush red carpets and walls, handcrafted wooden furniture with plush golden cushions. Sit, he told Isha, waving a hand at the sofas arranged around a table. Isha raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she sat, watching as he strode over to the wine cabinet and pulled out a bottle of mead, pouring them both a drink. It was pointless, of course, neither of them could become intoxicated and were both fully capable of both conjuring and cooking food far beyond what any normal humans could make, but the Emperor struggled to find the words to explain his dilemma to Isha, and this was an excuse to not speak to her, no matter how flimsy. Isha took the offered glass, and drank from it, idly dissecting the taste and ingredients of the beverage. Fermented honey, water, and raspberry, all wrapped together with just a hint of spice, with roughly 16% of the drink being alcohol. It was a pleasant beverage, and Isha drank more as she waited for the Emperor to speak. Many of her children would have sneered at it, but Isha could also sense the love and passion that had gone into making this beverage, almost a century ago by a humble woman and her daughter as the former taught the latter her craft. It was buried beneath the echo of the arrogance and greed of the noble family that owned the vineyard where the beverage had been made and had hoarded the bottle in their cellars until gifting it to the Emperor some years ago, but it was there. The Emperor's unusual show of hesitation was odd. She had never seen him like this, visibly mustering the will to tell her something he didn't want to talk about. Even after their time working together, she would have expected him to send her to her chambers and approach her when he was ready, not allow her to see even this small display of vulnerability. Strange, but not unwelcome. But it would be nice if the Emperor could begin to speak soon. It would make for a decent distraction from the daemons hammering against the ship's wards. After several long moments, the Emperor finally spoke. "I am worried for my son." Isha blinked, genuinely taken aback by the admission. Not the fact that he was worried, she did not think even the Emperor was so cold, but the fact that he was admitting it to her. "I cannot be certain of what kind of state he, or for that matter, any of my other children, will be in," the Emperor continued. "Chaos may have corrupted and mutated him, perhaps a daemon may be possessing him, any number of horrors are possible, and they have clouded my sight so heavily that I do not know what has happened to my son." He visibly hesitated at the next few words before forcing them out. "Your help with purifying and healing my son, if necessary, would be deeply appreciated." So that's what he was so nervous about. Honestly, did he expect her to refuse? Say that she would not help an innocent child? "You will have my help, of course," Isha assured him, placing her now empty glass on the table. "I will do everything in my power to help your son." The Emperor nodded, looking visibly relieved. "Thank you." Isha simply inclined her head in response, choosing not to press, seeing how difficult it had been for him to say the words. The Emperor seemed to consider something, his expression shifting from worry to something more thoughtful, before he spoke again. "Truth be told, concern for my children is why I wish to move as swiftly as possible. The faster I have conquered Terra and began to expand outwards, the faster I will find my sons. That is why I wish to increase the production of the Legion's asteroids with cloning, though it is not a permanent measure." And they were back to normal. Isha suppressed a sigh, though at least he was telling the truth, even if he was using it to manipulate her. But she understood. For her own children, she would and had done far worse. She was still not willing to make any clone soldiers for him, however. But, perhaps there was something else she could do for him. Something that would earn her a few concessions as well. Isha wondered what to offer him, her mind spinning through the possibilities faster than any mortal could conceive. She could improve his soldiers even more, of course, but even if he were amenable to giving her greater influence over their design, there was only so far genetic modification could go while still keeping his soldiers human. She had already given all medicines and crops that he might find useful. Isha could help with infrastructure, easily crafting forest cities and biotechnology such as trees designed to serve as energy reactors and grids, but that would likely be making the Imperium too reliant on her work for the Emperor's tastes. Wraithbone? No. She did not think it would be useless to him as she initially had. He could no doubt do something with it, but that made it too valuable a bargaining chip to give up so soon, at least not unless she gained something equally valuable in exchange. As much as she sympathized with the Emperor, she had her own children to think of. So what would help the Emperor accelerate his plans, then? And then the idea struck her. The navigators. In recent years, as she had been granted more and more freedom and knowledge of Terra and its people, Isha had learned from a start of a breed of genetically altered human psychics, who could peer into the ether and were employed to help navigate ships. There were several clans of them, and the Emperor had been making efforts to bring them into the fold, though it was still a work in progress. Isha was certain she could recreate and improve whatever genetic alterations had been made to the navigators, which would help the Emperor a great deal. He had no need of navigators personally, but he did need them to guide the fleet he was building. And improved navigators would no doubt be a boon. Isha might even be able to help teach them techniques that would improve their abilities beyond her genetic enhancements. Her children had developed warp navigation techniques of their own, in that all too brief time her children had explored the stars on their own before the old ones had decided to use them as weapons. And being the mother of the goddess of foresight meant you did pick up a few tricks along the way. They would need to be altered so humans could use them, but Isha was certain she could teach them some things. The Emperor arched a curious eyebrow, and taking the silent invitation, Isha began to explain. 27. Captain Alexandros, status report. The Emperor nodded as he stepped onto the bridge, Isha following behind. Your Majesty. The tall, dark-haired woman saluted sharply. All systems are at peak capacity, and the trip has been entirely smooth so far. The Emperor nodded. He had already known that, having continued guiding the ship even as he spoke to Isha, but it was always good to make sure. His conversation with Isha had been enlightening, he mused, casting a glance at her. Her offer of creating improved navigators was highly tempting, especially since she had promised to teach him how to create navigators himself, rather than relying solely on her for it. And the concession she had requested in exchange was not unreasonable. Still, he had told her he would need some time to think about it. It was prudent to not rush into these things. But that was for later. They were almost there. The Emperor focused, concentrating on Thonia. His son's soul shone ever more brightly, the shadow of chaos receding the closer the Emperor became. It was the 16th, the Emperor realized. The child he had shaped in the image of the ideal conqueror, strong and wise, who possessed both the power to crush the monsters that haunted the cosmos and the charisma to bring even the fiercest of enemies into the fold. But for now, still just a child. Young and innocent. The Emperor could almost sense the name this child had taken, it was just within his grasp, and there it was. Horus. Isha cautiously extended her senses into the ether, doing her best to ignore the burning gazes of the four. The fear was still there, but she could not let that fear rule her forever. And, oh, how it hurt to see the immaterium like this. Once upon a time the souls of 1,000,000 civilization had shone within the immaterium, and countless gods, from minor household spirits to the great gods of starfaring empires, had roamed across the warp. It had not been peaceful, exactly, there had always been pain and horror, with the ruinous powers lurking in the dark corners of the immaterium, but there had been beauty and wonder as well. Isha's own shining, verdant gardens, filled with her work since all the ages since the war in heaven. The wild, savage yet beautiful forests that were Kernus's domains, the worlds of dreams that Liliath had ruled, Val's magnificent silver forged, where he had crafted both weapons and wonders alike. The underworld over which Mereheg had reigned, overseeing the souls of Isha's children. Even Asuryan's blazing palaces of gold and crimson. And her children, oh, her children. How she had despaired as their civilization had crumbled after the sundering, as they desperately called out for their gods, praying not to be abandoned, pleading for salvation, for Asuryan to revoke his edict. And how proud Isha had been when they had finally rebuilt, when they had learned to live without the direct guidance of herself and her family. Even the wars against the resurgent Canib and Kruk that had forged the nascent dominion more than 1,000,000 years ago had made her proud, even as she had fretted and worried. But then, her children had gone mad. And in their hubris, they had destroyed everything. All those countless divine spirits were gone, destroyed, or devoured by the primordial annihilator, the shining worlds of Isha's children almost all defiled and ruined by their own sins. No longer did the immaterium shine with the souls and wonders of all the civilizations that had once roamed the galaxy, for they all had been either broken or destroyed utterly. All the beauty and splendor of the immaterium had been swept away, replaced only by the madness and ruin of chaos. Tamping down on both her tears and her rage, Isha focused determinedly on their destination, trying to ignore the rush of emotions looking into the sea of souls had brought on. Thonia was a ruined world, even more so than Terra, Isha realized with a pang in her heart. On Terra, there had been some traces of nature left even before she had come. Even the servants of the Four had not managed to eradicate or corrupt every trace of its beauty or life. Terra had been a damaged world, yes, and it still was, but it had still been alive. It had fought back against those who would defile it and thought it had come close to dying. It had not died. Not so for Thonia. It was truly a dead world, cold and utterly lifeless, not a trace of nature left. The only life left on the planet were the souls of the humans living amidst the ruin of the glories of their ancestors, and that of rodents in a few farms meant for harvesting food. But even those flickering lights of life were overshadowed by the echoes of the greed, cruelty, and suffering that had sunk into this world's very bones. Save for one. The Emperor's son. The child's soul shone brightly, warm and pure, the Emperor's mark very clear. There was no doubt this was a demigod. The Primarchs, as the Emperor called them, were akin to some of the most powerful champions and avatars that she and her kin had empowered in ages past. And yet, there was something about the child's soul that suggested there was more, Isha mused with a frown. The child wasn't just imbued with the Emperor's power. She looked closer and visibly jolted at what she found. Isha could not be certain until she got a proper look at the boy, but if the Emperor had really accomplished what she suspected, well, they might need to have another long talk about how he had done it. Commencing emergence from the warp now, the captain announced. We should arrive above Thonia in just a moment. Isha held her breath as the ship's warp drive, aided by the Emperor, opened a portal back into the Materium, and the ship slipped through it once more. With the heavy weight of the attention of the ruinous powers lessened, if not gone, Isha could not help but exhale in relief. They were still watching, but their attention was lessened now, some of it drifting away now that she and the Emperor were no longer within their domain. And yet, the humiliation of it still burned. Their domains had been her domains once, the Immaterium her home. But as her power had faded, her domains had shrunk, parts of it slowly but steadily chipped away at by Nurgle, others taken over and corrupted as the monstrosity that her children had birthed had gestated. And here she was now, reduced to a shadow of her former self, fully incarnate in the Materium for the first time, her family all gone, her children broken and scattered. All the rage and sorrow she'd been trying to ignore came rushing back once more, and Isha's heart screamed for both revenge and the return of her family. Isha would have her vengeance. She would save the souls of her children, inflict the same humiliation on the ruinous powers as they had inflicted on her, would see Slaanesh and Nurgle shattered at her feet. They would pay for destroying her children, for murdering her family. No matter what it took. Lady Isha. A voice cut her through her thoughts, and Isha looked at the source of the voice, Shield Captain Juno, only to realize that some of her power had escaped her control, that her eyes were burning green, and that everyone on the deck was staring at her unnerved, that Juno had her spear raised and that the Emperor had tensed, as if preparing to act. Embarrassed, Isha immediately clamped down on her power once more. The trip through the Immaterium had brought all her rage and bitterness to the fore, and now it might have cost her a great deal of goodwill from both the Emperor and his servants. My apologies, she said. I lost control there for a moment. It will not happen again. The Emperor's gaze bored through her, and Isha waited, uncertain if he would confine her to the ship's chambers with fresh wards, but ultimately, he just nodded. See that it does not. He commanded, before turning away to speak to the captain. Captain, Shield Captain Juno and Lady Isha will be heading down to the surface. You are to remain here in orbit, and keep an eye out for any potential enemies coming from outside this system. Isha suppressed a sigh of relief, even as she mentally winced at the nervous looks most of the bridge crew were directing at her, as well as the grim wariness emanating from Captain Juno. What an excellent way to start their arrival on Ctania, she thought morosely. Isha's momentary slip was concerning, if understandable, but the Emperor put it aside for the moment as they made their way to the shuttle bay, his concern for Horus overriding any other issues for the moment. But it was still something they would have to discuss later. They entered the shuttle bay, and were greeted by one of the officers, Lieutenant Abella, a man of average height with pale skin and short brown hair. Your Majesty, Abella said, bowing. We are at your service. Is there any of us you would prefer as a pilot? I have no need of a pilot today, Lieutenant, the Emperor dismissed, not bothering to stop his stride towards the shuttles, all of them built according to his personal designs. I will be piloting the ship myself. The lieutenant startled in shock even as he hurried to keep up with the Emperor, but he didn't object. As you wish, sire. The man said, making an admirable effort to clamp down on his reaction, even as he cast a glance at Juno and Isha behind them. Is there any specific shuttle you require? This one is fine, the guardian of mankind replied, entering the one closest to him, a gilded, golden vessel with the Raptor Imperialis painted on the side in white, large enough to comfortably fit more than a dozen people. Prepare the shuttle bay for launch. The lieutenant saluted and hurried off, as the three of them entered the shuttle and the Emperor ducked into the cockpit, starting the activation of its systems, flicking on various switches and lighting up the hololithic displays. But even as he ran through the familiar procedures, half his attention shifted elsewhere, his mind only distantly noting Isha and Juno settling into their seats. He was focused on finding his son, as well as the Star Hunters company that had been dispatched to this world. As the Emperor scanned Thonia, he was pleased to note that his son and the Star Hunters were in the same area, in one of the still functional hive cities, in the northern regions of the planet. Less pleasing was the fact that it was not far from the Mechanicum's base of operations. Reaching out, the Emperor focused on the Star Hunters, reaching into the mind of the leader of the company. Captain Gamal, report. In his mind's eye, the Emperor could see Gamal very clearly, a tall, stern man, with bronze skin and severe features, clad in the customary gray armor of the Star Hunters. The man had served the Imperium during the war, and had proven to be among the finest recruits of the 1st Space Marines, but that didn't matter right now, only what he knew. Gamal was standing atop a building, surveying the hive below him as the Emperor connected with his mind. To his credit, though Gamal flinched in shock at the sudden psychic touch, he was quick to respond. Lord Emperor, he said, giving the mental impression of a salute. Welcome to Thonia, Your Majesty. Captain, the Lord of Terra acknowledged as he started the shuttle's engines. Have you found my son? He felt a flicker of embarrassment from the Marine as Gamal responded. No, my lord. We have tracked him to the spire we are currently in, and we have attempted to corner him several times, but he has escaped us. But I am in pursuit of some of his followers now. Tell me what you have learned about my son and any obstacles we might have to deal with, then. The Emperor commanded as the bay doors opened at last, and he began guiding the shuttle out of the ship and into the void of space. Gamal stiffened to attention. The Primarch is the leader of a surprisingly large gang of, well, children, my lord, he began, having clearly prepared the report beforehand, though even so, the previous embarrassment intensified at the world children. They act primarily as raiders and thieves against the larger, more established gangs, but have been exceptionally successful thus far. Thus, they are wanted by various gang lords who wish to exact revenge for their actions against them, though some of the cannier ones wish to recruit the Primarch and his followers instead. None of them are a threat, however, and I have dissuaded all those who attempted to interfere with our pursuit of the Primarch. But they did slow us down, and I am afraid that we frightened some of the Primarch's followers when they saw us deal with the other gangs. We have tried not to frighten them further, but that has slowed us even more. Then, Gamal hesitated for a moment. And my lord, we do have one problem. The Primarch and his followers have raided the Mechanicum expedition more than once, and they too have a vested interest in locating him and retrieving what was stolen. I have done my best to sabotage their efforts, and we have encountered some of them, but I have not been able to persuade them to abandon their search outright. The Emperor suppressed a sigh as the shuttle escaped the confines of the ship, and began flying towards Thonia below. Of course. He should have expected that his son would be a troublemaker. This would have to be handled delicately. Still, Revelation couldn't help the flicker of amusement and pride at the fact that his son and a group of his fellow children were running circles around some of his best space marines, as well as Thonia's gangs and the Mechanicum expedition. I will deal with the Mechanicum once I have found my son, the Emperor replied. Do not attempt any further negotiations with the tech priests without my permission, but do not allow them near my son either. Attempt to keep casualties to a minimum, but do not hesitate to do what needs to be done. I will be landing soon to locate the Primarch. End your pursuit of my son's followers. Do not come to me, my son will be aware that you have been tracking him and will be warier if you are with me. Simply keep an eye out for the Mechanicum, and do not let them near my location. As for the gangs, if any more of them target my son or his followers, do whatever needs to be done. Gamal gave a mental salute. As you wish, sire. The Emperor gave the psychic equivalent of a curt nod, dismissing the mental connection a moment later and focusing fully on the task of piloting the shuttle. He itched to simply teleport directly to his son's location, but he doubted the boy would respond well to that. Even teleporting near him might scare the boy, depending on how developed his psychic senses were. No, this would have to be done the old-fashioned way, no matter how irritating the lack of speed was. I am coming, Horus, the Emperor thought grimly, his gaze in both the Materium and Warp fixed on the grey skies and dark cities of the planet below. Wait for me. The big men have backed off. They're not pursuing us anymore. You sure about that, Easy? Those Outworlders have been damn persistent so far. Ezekiel glared heatedly at his partner, but the older teenager was unfazed. Arek simply raised a golden eyebrow, his brown eyes fearless as he gazed back at the younger boy. Don't call me Easy, Ezekiel growled, hating how his voice cracked as he spoke. And yes, I'm sure. The leader just stopped and stood on top of a tower for some reason, and then he made all of them pull back. Arek said. A thoughtful frown crossed his face, a rare expression on the usually cheerful teenager. I don't like it, he said eventually. They've been trying to catch us all for days, giving even Horus trouble, and now they've just stopped? Something is going on. Yeah, Ezekiel admitted. He had had the same thought. Should we keep an eye on them, see what they do? Arek's frown deepened as he pulled a cigarette out of his pocket. Maybe. But these Outworlders are strange. I don't think we'll learn anything they don't want us to. I think we should go see the boss. Horus will be able to figure out more than we can. Yeah, but what if they follow us back to Horus? We don't have a choice, Arek countered, lighting the cigarette. We can't just stay out here. We're almost out of money, and even if the new Outworlders aren't breathing down our neck anymore, the other gangs and the Mechanicum are. Staying away from Horus won't do us much good. And we won't be able to avoid getting captured much longer either. It's taken every trick that the boss came up with to not get caught, and even then, we've barely escaped. Ezekiel scowled. Arek was right, but that didn't mean he had to like it. He hated the idea of leading an enemy straight to their boss. But staying away wouldn't do much good either, especially when they were on the verge of being captured anyway. Fine, Ezekiel grumbled. Let's go back. Arek nodded, taking a drag from his cigarette. They made their way through the city, through the winding roads below the towers of black steel and glass with flashing neon signs, doing their best to blend in with the crowds scurried beneath omnipresent grey clouds, masked against the chemical taint that hung heavy in the air. It was nothing out of the ordinary. The factory they were passing by was pumping who knew what into the air, like 1,000 other factories on Thonia, and there were workers queuing at the doors, all of them haggard and pale, but with no choice but to do the work that the gang demanded. Others were walking around as always underneath the neon lights of the buildings. Street kids hustling for money, civilians shopping for prosthetics and implants, drug dealers selling their wares, cripples begging on the street. There was a sharp stench in the air as they passed a shop, different from usual, which Ezekiel recognized as the smell of a failing Atmo filter. It would probably kill everyone in the building when it went. It wasn't his problem. Either the people who ran the shop would fix it themselves, or they would die. This was how Thonia had always been, as Ezekiel had known it from birth. This city was little different from where he had grown up. But there was an air of tension that wasn't usually there. And it was because of the new Outworlders, the so-called Space Marines. They were so different from the tech priests, who usually didn't care what anyone on Thonia did as long as they stayed out of their way, and on the rare occasion they wanted something, they'd either pay for it or just take it. The new Outworlders didn't do that, Ezekiel thought, as he casually broke the fingers of a kid who tried to pickpocket him without even looking down. They had focused on looking around, asking strange questions and hunting for Horus. They had even brutally smashed some of the other gangs on Horus's tail, like the Sokolovs, who had ruled this region just a week ago. The Sokolovs had been hunting Horus, and the Outworlders had asked them to turn over all their information to them and stop their search. When the Sokolov boss had laughed in their face, the Outworlders had killed him and his lieutenants and burned his base to the ground. Ezekiel shivered slightly at the memory. He had watched them do it, and even from a distance, those grey giants had been terrifying, just 3 of them ripping apart the dozens that the Solokovs had thrown at them. He hadn't even been able to see them move. They'd just been white blurs cutting through the ranks of the Sokolov as if they were nothing. The worst part was that they couldn't figure out why the Outworlders wanted Horus so badly. Not even the boss could figure it out. Things were on edge, and Ezekiel didn't know when they'd go back to normal. Horus would take care of it, Ezekiel assured himself. There was nothing that could stop Horus. He was the closest thing to a god that Thonia had, and unlike those old, fake stories, he was real. When Ezekiel had been younger, he'd asked his father why the gods let Thonia be the way it was, why they didn't do anything to help. Because the gods are angry, boy, the old bastard had replied. They're angry that Thonia is ruled by scum and not by us. We're the blood of the gods, boy, and when we conquer this world, they will show us their favor. Ezekiel had believed it wholeheartedly at the time, because he had been a fool who didn't know that his father was even more of a fool. Now, he couldn't help but think it had all just been children's stories. All gods were stories. None of them had ever actually come down to do anything on Thonia. The old gods that the Abaddons claimed descent from, the Dragon King worshipped by the Ormur, the machine god of the Mechanicum Outworlders, all of them were useless. But Horus was real. He was faster and stronger than a dragon, smarter than the most cunning gang lords and with more charm than all the other people on Thonia put together. He looked like he had walked straight out of one of those old legends they told children, but unlike those childish tales, Horus actually existed. He couldn't have been more different from Ezekiel, with his skinny frame, his scarred face and the scowl he was always wearing. It was honestly hard to believe that Horus was younger than him. It had taken months before Horus had convinced him that it was the truth, and not some joke. But for all their differences, Ezekiel had never doubted his decision to join up with Horus. It had been after he had accidentally killed his father and been forced to flee from his gang. He had been all alone, starving, on the run, hunted by the rest of his old gang, when Horus found him. Horus had taken him in, had given him a place to belong again. And Ezekiel knew, without a doubt, that Horus was more than just another gang lord. It was impossible not to. Not with the presence that Horus emanated at all times. He wasn't human, he was something else. Something that didn't need to pretend to have the blood or favor of a god. Hey, kid, stop brooding, we're here. Ezekiel snapped out of his reverie and glared at Erek, though the older boy remained infuriatingly unfazed as they entered an alleyway between 2 tall grey buildings, both rusted ruins, but old ones that had stood for centuries. The alleyway was littered with rocks and debris from the ruined buildings, and even a corpse, Ezekiel noticed with some disgust. Someone had dumped a dead body here recently, just a few meters away from them. The stench of the rotting corpse and blood hadn't been noticeable through the usual blanket of bleaching agents and industrial waste from a distance, but now it was close enough for them to smell. But the 2 of them ignored the corpse, picking their way through the debris, careful not to trip over anything. If they did, the jagged rocks and fragment of rusted steel would probably be lethal. Finally, once they were deep into the alleyway, Ezekiel walked up to the building on the left, running his hands across the wall as Erek kept a wary watch out. After several moments, Ezekiel found what he was looking and pressed it, and an entire section of the wall slid away. The 2 of them hurried in, with Ezekiel quickly sliding the wall shut by pressing a panel on the right wall. They entered a dimly lit hallway, a staircase at the end leading downwards. And down they went, walking in the weak, flickering orange light until they reached a steel door, one with a single slit in the middle. Erek knocked on the door. "It's us, let us in." "Password?" a high-pitched voice asked. "Alpha Night Wolf King." Erek replied, as Ezekiel tapped his foot impatiently. "Password accepted," the voice replied, and the door slid open, revealing a small, dark-haired girl dressed in a leather jacket, shirt, skirt, and knee-high boots, all black, standing behind it. "Welcome back, guys." "Alyssa," Erek nodded, though Ezekiel ignored and her strode into the room. "How are things?" "Mostly fine, Boss is making a plan to deal with the Outworlders. Alyssa replied as Ezekiel looked around the room, ignoring Erek and Alyssa's small talk. It hadn't changed much since he had been here a week ago, not that he had expected to. It was a vast room, more cavern than hall, the walls painted jet black with red highlights and the whole space illuminated by white fluorescent lights running across the length of the ceiling, high above them. Most of the others were milling around, some playing card games, some of them eating at the tables that had been laid out near the left wall, some tinkering with this or that. Several of them looked up, curious at Ezekiel and Erek's entrance, but didn't come closer, only casting glances in their direction. Towards the right, and deeper into the room, there were their trophy cases, the best things they'd ever stolen. The prize gun of the now-dead Solikov gang lord, a family sword owned by the Higurashi gang who ruled the next region, a large laser rifle taken from the Mechanicum's tech guard, each and every one of them made Ezekiel grin at the sight of them. Further along was the armory and vehicles, also consisting mostly of things they'd stolen. But before Ezekiel could reminisce on them, he was distracted. Ezekiel, Erek. It's good to see you both. Ezekiel turned his head to the source of the voice and grinned as he saw his boss, Horace. Horace was more or less the same height as Ezekiel himself, though much broader and more muscular, in a way that no child should have been. His scruffy dark hair flowed down to his neck, clearly having not been cut in some time, and Horace was wearing a knee-length silver coat over a black shirt, black trousers with a matching silver belt and boots, and fingerless black gloves. As he came closer, everyone stiffened to attention and watched him closely, their leader's presence drawing everyone's attention away from what they'd been doing. Horace was beaming as he came forward to them. "I knew you two could do it," he said with a grin. "If anyone could shake off those Outworlders, it would be you two." At this, Ezekiel's smile faded somewhat, which Horace noticed, raising an eyebrow. "What? Is something wrong?" "Well, you see, boss, we didn't shake them off," Ezekiel said, chuckling slightly nervously. "They let us go." Horace's grin vanished, replaced by a frown. "Tell me everything," he said, his expression intense now. "Well." Ezekiel reluctantly began to explain, not particularly eager to confess how they had struggled not to get caught by the Outworlders. But it had to be done. For several moments Horace absorbed the story of their difficulties silently, before nodding sharply once Ezekiel finished. "Don't worry, I have a plan." Ezekiel smiled, and he could feel the atmosphere lighten as Horace spoke. Of course he did. Horace always had a plan, and Ezekiel was sure he'd solve their problems soon. There was nothing to worry about. 28. The stars fascinated Horace. They were not visible often on Thonia, not with the ash and smoke that polluted the planet's skies. But when they were beautiful. Like gemstones set in the sky, impossible and beautiful, hinting at the splendor and wonders that lay beyond Thonia. Horace wanted that. More than anything, he wanted to see the stars for himself, to reach out and take them in his grasp, to see all that lay beyond Thonia's gray skies, and lay his eyes on the impossible marvels that the people of his world could only dream of. And he wanted to show them to his gang too, as he had already shown them all how they didn't need to be bound by what the old men and women of Thonia said. He had already shared his dream with them, and though all of them had thought he was crazy at first, they had come around. Everyone said it was impossible, of course. There were stories of ancient heroes and gods voyaging across the stars, but they were just legends. Nobody knew how to recreate their feats, though many had tried. Nobody except the tech priests of Mars, who jealously guarded their secrets and their starships. People had tried to bargain with them, to steal from them, it had never worked. Not until Horace and his friends. The memory still brought a smile to his lips. Stealing one of their cogitators had been difficult, and it had very nearly cost his life, or at least his freedom, but he had stolen it, even if trying to sort the information within to find the secrets of how to travel the stars had proven more difficult than he had imagined. Still, he had been making progress, until they had come. The Terrans. Those white-armored giants that called themselves the Star Hunters, who had completely upset the order of things and come in search of Horus himself, for some strange reason. More importantly, they had come in ships that could traverse the stars just like the Martian ships, yet so different. They had to steal one of those ships, Horus knew. no matter what it cost. He refused to stay on Thonia, trapped on this broken wreck of a world, unable to rise higher than any of the petty gang lords. Horus was sure that he was meant for something more. They all were, Abaddon, Erech, Alyssa, all the others, they all deserved better than this. Thonia was just a prison they had to escape from. All his dreams would come true once he reached the stars, he was sure of it. All Horus had to do was get there. So, boss, what's the plan? Horus was shaken from his thoughts and looked up to stare at Ezekiel, Erech, and Alyssa, all three of whom were looking at him concernedly from in front of his desk, a large, ornate thing made of metal, painted black with silver designs, stolen from the boss of the Rayan gang, along with the silver throne-like chair that Horus was sitting on. It was Ezekiel who had spoken, but Horus could see the question in all of their eyes, along with a hidden fear of what would happen if the giants found them. Honestly, Horus was a little offended. Didn't they trust him? He had told them he had a plan. Still, he should explain it to them. The plan is simple, my friends, Horus said, smiling slightly as he saw their fear lessen. We just have to steal one of the Terran ships, and then escape this planet. Steal the ship. Alyssa repeated. How? It was only a question, there was no actual doubt in her voice, Horus was pleased to note. We have to distract them, of course, Horus said, his grin widening. And the bait will be me. I'll keep them running in circles, while you guys steal a ship. Then we'll regroup, and leave the planet. Won't the ships be guarded? Erech asked. How are you going to get the guards away? I'll go to the ships first myself, Horus explained. The guards will chase after me, and then you guys can sneak in. I've taught Alyssa a lot of the stuff from the Martian cogitator, I'm sure she can figure out how to fly the ship. All three of them nodded now, buoyed by his confidence and his plan. Then let's do it, Ezekiel said eagerly. I want to get off this planet. Horus grinned at his eagerness. We will, tomorrow. But you and Erech need to rest up first. Ezekiel scowled at that, but nodded reluctantly. Horus appreciated his enthusiasm, though. Opening his mouth to dismiss them, Horus was interrupted by Erech hurrying up to them. Horus regarded him, puzzled, wondering why Erech had left his shift on guard, and why he looked so pale. Boss, the red-haired boy said, his blue eyes darting nervously. There's someone who wants to talk to you. A little while earlier, the Emperor guided the ship down to the top of a skyscraper, not too far from where his son was. Part of him wanted to land closer, but it would do no good to scare the boy. At last, the ship settled on its destination, and the Emperor rose to his feet, telekinetically deactivating the ship's engines as he hurried out of the cockpit. Stay here, he commanded swiftly as he rushed past Isha and Juno. He wanted to meet his son alone, and bringing other people along would complicate things. I will be back soon, do not go far from the ship. Juno nodded her head, though Isha looked irritated. The Emperor knew she would not risk testing his patience, however, so he hurried out of the ship without waiting for her response. Emerging out into the polluted air of Thonia, atop a grey skyscraper, the Emperor took a moment to cast a simple but powerful ward around the ship to deter chaos, just in case. Then, he wrapped a veil of concealment around himself. He was not in the mood to attract attention, and the veil would quietly redirect the mind of anyone who saw him. Once that was done, the Emperor took off at a sprint, vaulting over the edge of the building and landing on the roof of the smaller one ahead, using his powers to ensure that landing was smooth and silent, causing no sound nor any damage to the building. It was more undignified than anything he had done in some time, but it wasn't as if anyone was there to see it. Continuing his run, the Emperor jumped across several more buildings, until finally arriving at his destination. His son was below, he could feel it. He briefly paused to consider how best to approach his son, and the other, smaller souls he could feel below. The melodramatic part of him suggested phasing through the building or simply teleporting down below to appear in front of them, but he dismissed that after a moment's thought. Frightening children would do no good. The simple approach, then. Jumping off the building, the Emperor landed in the alleyway down below, his inhumanely sharp eyes easily locating the hidden entrance on the left. It was the remnant of some old, broken-down security system, but it was cleverly concealed enough to have fooled most. A good hiding place for his son, the emperor thought approvingly. Still, it was no challenge to him. Opening the entrance, the emperor strode into the basement, psychically sliding it shut behind him as he made his way down the stairs. Extending his senses for a moment, the emperor listened to his son's conversation, feeling increasingly amused at the boy's plan. He had to admire the sheer audacity of it. It wasn't a bad strategy either, though the boy was overconfident. The actual tactics were overly simplistic, and he didn't have nearly enough information on the abilities of the asteroids or the ship systems. Well, there would be enough time to correct that later. Reaching the steel door, the emperor causally expanded the veil of concealment to cover the entire area. It would no longer conceal him from his son or the boy's followers, but it would prevent anyone from interrupting. Raising a hand, the Lord of Terra knocked sharply on the door. Behind the slit, a nervous voice spoke. "Oh, hello, sir. Who are you?" The emperor favored the child behind the door with an indulgent smile, making sure to modulate his psychic aura so as not to scare the boy too much. "I have some business with your leader. Would you mind letting me in so I can speak to him?" Horus hurried to the door. Eric's tale sounded unbelievable, some great golden giant coming to speak to Horus. It sounded ridiculous, but Eric was smart and brave, and he wouldn't have been easily deceived like that. Whoever had found them and scared him like that would have to be good. "Aim your weapons," Horus ordered as everyone watched the door carefully, those with guns aiming them at the entrance while the others clutched their knives or donned their knuckle dusters. Whoever had come would have no chance against all of them, and especially not him. Horus was sure of it. Capturing him would be simple, and once they'd interrogated him on how he'd found them, they'd kill him. They'd have to abandon this base though, which was irritating. The stranger was due some pain for that. "Open the door," Horus growled at Erek, settling into a stance, ready to rush forward and knock the bastard out. But as soon as Erek pulled the door open, all thoughts of fighting abandoned him. The emperor swallowed as he laid eyes on his son. His son, who was strong and healthy, untainted, and pure. His soul shone so brightly, and even though he had crafted it himself, to see its light once more took the emperor's breath away. He could hardly think of what to say. He had been a father before, and a mother too, in those eras where he had preferred the form of a woman, but he was so very different from the person he had been back then. Those younger, more innocent versions of himself would hardly have recognized the emperor of mankind. They certainly wouldn't have liked him. And this boy was so different from his other children too. Children who had died, or simply left, because they could no longer bear his presence, could no longer follow him and his vision. He did not blame them, not anymore, but the memory still hurt. And most of all, there were the children he had killed with his own hands. Those who had begged for it as a mercy, and those who had fallen so far that he had had no choice but to destroy them for being a danger to humanity. And if he said the wrong thing, he could drive away this boy too. "Do not be sentimental," his pragmatic side said. "The boy is a tool, a weapon, nothing more. To grow attached to him is folly. We must wield him as effectively as we can to ensure that humanity survives and thrives. Gaining his loyalty and affection is important, but he is not our child. He is not a child at all." And yet, the emperor could not bring himself to fully believe that as he looked into the boy's eyes. His son's eyes. This beautiful child whose mind, body, and soul he had slowly, painstakingly created over the course of several decades, who had been torn from him by those wretched creatures in the warp that thought of themselves as gods. Instincts he had thought long dead howled at him to wrap his son in every layer of protection he could, to shield him from every horror and danger in this dark and terrible universe. But that was not a viable solution. The emperor needed this boy and his brothers to help him, to save humanity and restore them to their rightful place. And even he, for all his power, could not keep the boy safe forever. So he hardened his heart even as he smiled at the boy. "Hello, son. It has been a very long time." Eric had been telling the truth, Horus thought, stunned. Standing in front of them really was a golden giant. He was taller than even the Terran Space Marines, clad in an ornate black and gold military uniform. Horus had seen some warlords and their soldiers style themselves as such, but this uniform put them all to shame. It consisted of a tunic, trousers, and gloves, all black, though the tunic was trimmed in gold, with the buttons, collar, and the bird-like symbol upon the man's chest also in gold. The giant seemed very fond of gold, for his gilded belt, armored thigh-length boots, strange thick necklace and the crown of leaves upon his head were the same color. And he literally shone, with impossible golden eyes peering out of stern, severe but handsome features and into Horace's very soul. The golden light pressed down on Horace, leaving him utterly speechless. He could hardly tear his eyes away from the man, let alone fight him. And his friends all around him were the same, staring at the golden man, utterly dumbstruck. This was the warlord that Horace had always dreamed of being, the perfect soldier and general, the greatest warrior of them all, unstoppable and invincible. And then the man spoke, and Horace choked on his own breath. "Son." The emperor nodded, having expected this reaction. "Yes," he said calmly. "I am the Emperor of Terra, and you are my son, Horace. You have met some of my men, I believe, the Space Marines." The boy looked dumbfounded at the revelation, as did all his companions around him. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" the boy said finally. "And if those were your men, why were they after me?" "Good," the boy wasn't taking him at face value. "My men were after you because I sent them," the emperor replied calmly. "As for your other question, you are faster, stronger, more intelligent than ordinary men and women. Superhuman, one might say. You grow faster too. How old are you, boy?" "Ah, yes, 3 years old." "Your growth and abilities are extraordinary, impossible for any human being." "That is because of me. My blood runs through your veins. Here, let me show you." Moving just fast enough to be completely beyond the realm of mortal man, but slow enough for Horace and his gang to perceive him, the emperor swiftly disarmed each and every one of them in less than a minute, before returning to where he had been standing and letting all his arms clatter to the ground. They all regarded him and the pile of weapons, stupefied. "Convinced?" the emperor asked. "Well, if not, let me give you another demonstration." Employing his inhumane speed once more, he plucked all the weapons from the ground, this time rearming each of the children swiftly, before once more moving back to stand in front of the door. "You are the only person here capable of such things, Horace," the emperor continued. "Not quite at this level, I imagine, but you will be soon." Horace swallowed, looking nervous, before a spark of anger surfaced in his eyes. "If I'm your son, where were you? Why did you abandon me?" The accusation stung, but the emperor pushed it down. "If you are my son, Horace, you can feel it, I know you can. And I did not abandon you. You were stolen from me, by my enemies. They broke into the heart of my palace and cast you into the stars, and you came here, to this world. And now, I have found you, at last. What do you want?" Horace asked finally, visibly shaken. "What I want is simple," the emperor said quietly, stepping forward to place a hand on his son's shoulder. "To take you home. Come with me, Horace, let us leave Thonia behind. I will show you the stars, I will show our home world, Terra. And eventually, the whole galaxy." Isha waited impatiently outside the ship, leaning against it and tapping her foot. She could feel the emperor and his son some miles away, finally together, and while she was pleased for the emperor and understood why he had gone to meet the boy alone, it was still tedious to just wait here with nothing to do. The fact that she could feel the forces of chaos focused on her through the warp certainly didn't help. They didn't dare attack, even in her weakened state. They would need more time and preparation to summon a force into the immaterium capable of challenging her, and, of course, the emperor was only a short distance away, but it was a distinctly unpleasant feeling. On Terra, the emperor's home world, his domain, and where he had used his power for millennia, leaving traces of it everywhere, and especially in his own heavily warded palace, the presence of chaos was much easier to ignore, but here. Grimacing, Isha tried to redirect her thoughts to other matters. Casting a look at the grey skies, even worse than Terra's had been before she had begun her work, Isha was sorely tempted to clear the planet's atmosphere as much as she could, and perhaps restore some non-human life, but after her loss of control on the ship, it wouldn't do to antagonize the Emperor. She would wait until he was back and she could ask permission. Sighing, she cast a glance at Shield Captain Juno, who was standing beside her, immovable and silent as always. Isha was sorely tempted to try to make some conversation, but she knew it would be useless. The girl's conditioning was too strong, designed to make her the perfect and obedient soldier. Isha could remove it, but that would anger the emperor too much. The custodians in general were people Isha pitied. The emperor had taken them as infants, molded them into living weapons. It was difficult not to feel sorry for them. They did not live, not truly. They were organic machines, designed for one purpose by their master. If she was being honest with herself, the custodians reminded her of the same conditioning that the old ones had imposed upon her children, upon the Kruk, upon their weapon races who had died during the war in heaven, such as the Seraphon. It awakened bitter memories for her, and Isha was glad that the emperor had let her modify the process for the Astaroths, instead of employing the original process he had created. They were still subject to indoctrination, but at least now the process was for adults who chose that life, not inflicted on children who understood nothing of what they were to be subjected to. Shaking her head, Isha returned her attention to the emperor and his son and was pleased to note that they were making their way back, along with a number of mortal souls, young and childlike, presumably the boy's friends. The emperor was having to make his way back more slowly to accommodate the children, but at least he was on his way back. Settling down on the floor, Isha closed her eyes, deciding to meditate for the time being. For almost an hour, Isha concentrated, doing her best to ignore Chaos's attention as she examined the planet as best as she could from her limited avatar. There were 8,234,000 human souls within the city. There were 27,999,975 forms of animal life, mostly rats, insects and other small life forms. An even greater number of microbes and fungi. And finally, there were exactly 28 plants within the city, each and every one of them carefully preserved in various forms of stasis. Further out, far from the city, she could sense some farms churning out artificial crops, but the farms were old, and the crops were not nearly as good as the actual thing. Perhaps she could convince the emperor to let her do something about that. Closer by, there was the Mechanicum expedition, most of it made up of cyborgs who had replaced much of their bodies with machines, but whose souls were no less bright for that. There were also a large number of slaves, Isha noted with disapproval, who had been lobotomized and turned into machines used for labor. Disgusting, but she supposed she couldn't expect better, given where these particular humans were from. And so, Isha continued, observing the planet and the people from various angles as she waited, until, at last, Isha opened her eyes to look at the emperor, standing in front of her, a small army of children behind him, and his son at his side. And as soon as she had laid eyes upon the boy, Isha's suspicions were confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt. But that would have to wait. Rising to her feet, Isha bowed briefly. "Welcome back, Your Majesty. I am glad you found your son, and his friends," she added, smiling at the children. The emperor nodded. "Horus insisted that we bring them along," he said, a slight undercurrent of amusement to his voice. "I have called down several more shuttles from the Epona to fetch them. We will be returning to the ship soon." "Hello, child," Isha said to the boy. She could sense that mingled joy, astonishment, and uncertainty he felt, wanting to believe the emperor was his father, but not yet entirely convinced. Well, hopefully, the emperor would handle that properly, and assuage the boy's doubts. Isha would offer advice, but she doubted the advice would be appreciated, much less accepted. But she could hardly wait to be back on the ship and speak to the emperor about the boy in private. They had a lot to talk about. Check the description for the links to the author.